Consider the most fundamental question that has ever been asked. Why does anything exist at all? In every corner of the observable universe, from the smallest quantum fluctuation to the largest galactic supercluster, there is something rather than nothing, and this brute fact confronts us with a mystery so profound that it resists easy resolution. We live within a cosmos filled with matter and energy, with conscious beings capable of wondering about their own existence, with physical laws that govern the motion of planets and the decay of atoms. And yet nowhere in any of these phenomena do we find a satisfying explanation for why there is something rather than absolute nothingness. The psychological mechanism at work here is that our minds are fundamentally oriented toward seeking causes and explanations, toward tracing back effects to their origins, and yet this particular question seems to demand an explanation that lies beyond the scope of any explanation we could possibly give. We are creatures born into a world already in motion, already populated with objects and forces, and we have become so accustomed to asking why specific things are the way they are that we rarely pause to confront the deeper absurdity of existence itself. The very act of seeking an explanation for why something exists requires that something already exists to do the seeking, which means we are trapped within a logical circle from which there is no escape. We have normalized this mystery by folding it into our scientific frameworks and philosophical systems, treating it as either a fundamental axiom that requires no further justification or as a question that lies forever beyond the reach of human understanding. And in doing so, we have allowed ourselves to stop experiencing the vertigo that such contemplation should properly induce in us. Consider for a moment the nature of your current experience. You are reading or listening to these words, perceiving them as real, interpreting their meaning, and constructing a narrative sense of continuity about where you are and what is happening around you. Your brain is processing sensory information, creating the vivid impression of a coherent world with physical laws, cause and effect, and logical progression through time. You feel the weight of your body, perhaps the texture of fabric against your skin, the ambient temperature of the air surrounding you. These sensations feel undeniably real, grounded in physical reality, as though you are genuinely present in this moment. Yet consider that every single one of these experiences, the visual details, the sounds, the physical sensations, the emotional responses, the sense of self observing it all, can be replicated almost perfectly by your brain in the state of sleep. When you dream, you do not typically recognize that you are dreaming, because the neurological mechanisms that generate waking consciousness are fully engaged in generating the dream state. The subjective experience of dreaming feels as real as waking life does right now, complete with continuity, logic, and a sense of being a conscious entity navigating a world. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the brain's remarkable capacity to generate entire realities without external input, relying only on patterns of neural activation, memory consolidation, and the construction of narrative meaning. When you sleep, your brain essentially creates a complete simulation of existence that feels absolutely convincing from the inside. The troubling implication is that there exists no internal, subjective test you can perform right now to definitively confirm that you are not currently dreaming. The very mechanisms that would reveal the inconsistencies of a dream, logical reasoning, critical reflection, memory checking, can all be partially or wholly simulated within a dream itself, creating a recursive problem of verification. Consider the peculiar nature of your experience with time as you move through each day, noticing how you perceive moments flowing one after another in an ordered sequence, how you remember the past as something fixed and unchangeable, while the future remains uncertain and unmaterialized, and how this creates a sense of constant progression through existence that feels undeniably real and fundamental to consciousness itself. Yet when you examine this experience more closely, when you ask physicists and philosophers what time fundamentally is, you encounter a curious problem that has persisted for centuries, which is that time appears to be something we experience rather than something that objectively exists in the universe independent of our perception of it. The physical laws that govern reality, particularly those described by Einstein's theory of relativity, treat time as merely another dimension woven into the fabric of spacetime, neither more fundamental nor more real than the three dimensions of space, suggesting that what we experience as the flow of time might be an illusion created by consciousness rather than an objective feature of reality itself. The psychological mechanism behind our conviction that time is real stems from the fact that our brains are structured in such a way that we can only process information sequentially, only remember the past and anticipate the future, creating an inherent bias toward experiencing reality as if it were ordered temporally, when in fact the universe might be entirely static, with all moments existing simultaneously. And our consciousness simply moving through this static block, like a needle playing across a record that already exists in full. We have normalized this experience of time so completely, organizing our entire civilization around its apparent flow, creating calendars and clocks and schedules as if we were measuring something objectively real, when in reality we may be doing nothing more than cataloging our own neurological experience of processing information in a particular way. Consider that across every culture, every era, and every corner of human civilization, there exists an overwhelming consensus about one thing: that death is the end of something, yet the beginning of something else entirely, though what that something else might be remains perhaps the greatest unanswered question that haunts our species. We construct elaborate belief systems around this moment, from religious frameworks that promise heavens and hells and reincarnations, to scientific materialist views that suggest consciousness simply ceases, to more esoteric philosophies that propose transformation into energy or spiritual dimensions beyond our sensory perception. Yet standing at the threshold of this mystery, we face a peculiar human condition. We cannot know what happens after death because to know it would require the experience of death itself, and no person has ever returned to deliver verifiable testimony of what lies beyond that boundary. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound and unavoidable, for our minds are designed to fear extinction and to seek continuity, so we naturally populate the unknown void with narratives that comfort us, whether those narratives come from tradition, community, or personal intuition. We create afterlife stories not because we have evidence, but because the alternative, the possibility of absolute nothingness, of permanent cessation, produces such existential dread that our consciousness recoils from it, searching desperately for some meaning, some continuation, some purpose to our finite existence. What remains remarkable is how we have normalized this fundamental uncertainty, treating our preferred afterlife beliefs as settled truths rather than unprovable hypotheses, passing them down through generations as if they were facts rather than hopes, allowing our deepest guesses about death to shape how we live our lives while never questioning whether those guesses hold any actual validity, and perhaps never truly needing to. Because the question itself persists in this suspended state where certainty remains forever impossible. Consider the moment you decide to reach for a glass of water, or choose what to say in a conversation, or decide which path to take on your evening walk. These feel like genuine choices, moments where you are the author of your own actions, where your consciousness deliberates and then executes your will into the world. Yet beneath this comfortable illusion lies a far more unsettling question. Are these decisions truly yours, or are they merely the inevitable result of prior causes extending infinitely backward through time, through your genetics, your upbringing, the specific arrangement of neurons in your brain at that precise moment, the laws of physics that govern all matter? When neuroscientists examine the brain, they find that electrical activity associated with a decision often precedes conscious awareness of that decision by several seconds, suggesting that your brain has already chosen before you consciously experience the choice. The physical universe operates according to deterministic laws, or at least probabilistic ones, leaving no obvious room for a decision-maker who exists outside this causal chain. And yet we organize our entire moral and legal system around the assumption that people freely choose their actions and therefore deserve praise or punishment accordingly. We experience ourselves as free, as agents capable of real alternatives, even though the very concept becomes philosophically problematic when examined carefully. Perhaps free will is neither completely determined nor completely free, but rather compatibilist, the idea that free will and determinism can coexist, that freedom means acting according to your own desires without external coercion, regardless of whether those desires were themselves determined. Or perhaps it is something we cannot help but believe in because the alternative, that we are merely biological machines executing predetermined sequences, is too existentially destabilizing for human consciousness to fully integrate and still function. Consider the profound impossibility of accessing your own non-existence, that vast stretch of time before your consciousness emerged into the world, before your brain formed its first neural pathways, and before your awareness could register anything at all. You have no memories of this period, no sensory impressions, no thoughts or feelings to retrieve, yet you existed in some form as potential, as genetic material waiting to be assembled, as an idea in the minds of others who had no way of knowing what you would become. The question itself creates a peculiar cognitive dissonance because it asks you to contemplate something that, by definition, you cannot have experienced, cannot have observed, and cannot have any direct knowledge of whatsoever. Your consciousness simply did not exist before birth, and yet here you are, thinking about that very absence, trying to locate yourself in a timeline where you had no location at all. The psychological mechanism behind our struggle with this question lies in our brain's fundamental inability to imagine true non-existence, since the very act of imagining requires a consciousness doing the imagining. We can conceive of sleep, of unconsciousness, of darkness, but these are still experiences filtered through our existing awareness, still interpreted by minds that know what it means to be conscious. True non-existence falls beyond the reach of human cognition in the same way that the color beyond ultraviolet cannot be seen by human eyes, not because it is hidden, but because the apparatus required to perceive it simply does not function in that way. We have normalized our relationship with this unanswerable question by largely avoiding it, by treating the moment of birth as a convenient beginning, as though consciousness simply switched on like a light at a specific moment, rather than asking whether such a moment could ever truly be pinpointed. Consider the fundamental isolation of your own consciousness, that undeniable fact that you experience the world through a single perspective, through your own eyes and mind alone, with no direct access to the inner experiences of anyone around you. You wake each morning and encounter other people, bodies that move and speak and respond to you, yet you have never actually experienced their consciousness from the inside, never felt their thoughts or sensations or subjective reality the way you feel your own. When someone tells you they are in pain, you do not feel that pain yourself. You only observe their behavior, hear their words, and infer that pain exists within them based on patterns you have learned to recognize. This is the strange predicament of solipsism, the philosophical position that suggests perhaps only your mind is certain to exist, and everything else, including other conscious beings, might be elaborate constructions of your own perception. The logical mechanism underlying this doubt is actually quite simple. Direct experience is your only absolute proof of consciousness, yet direct experience of another's mind is impossible by definition. You cannot step outside your own perspective to verify that the person before you is not merely a sophisticated automaton, a philosophical zombie that behaves exactly as a conscious being would while containing no actual inner experience. Every moment of your life involves an act of faith, an assumption that other minds exist similar to your own, an inference you make based on analogy and behavior rather than certainty. What is remarkable is how easily we dismiss this profound epistemological problem in daily life, how we have normalized this logical gap between what we can prove and what we assume to be true. We have constructed entire societies, legal systems, and moral frameworks on the unverifiable assumption that other people are conscious in the way we are conscious, and we proceed forward with such confidence despite never being able to prove this foundational assumption in any rigorous sense. Consider the peculiar position of consciousness within existence itself, where we find ourselves as observers embedded within a universe governed by mathematics and physical laws so precise that they can be encoded, computed, and potentially replicated by sufficiently advanced technology. The simulation hypothesis suggests that the reality we experience might not be fundamental, but rather derivative, a constructed environment running on some form of substrate we cannot perceive, much like how characters in a video game exist within programmed worlds, unaware of the hardware beneath them. When we examine the nature of quantum mechanics, we encounter phenomena that seem almost algorithmic in nature, where particles exist in superposition until observed, collapsing into definite states only when measured, as though reality itself operates on a render-on-demand principle similar to how computational systems optimize processing by only calculating what is necessary to observe. The universe also reveals itself through discrete mathematical structures, suggesting that at the smallest scales, reality might not be continuous, but rather composed of fundamental units that operate according to programmable rules, much as pixels compose digital images or bits compose digital information. This intellectual framework persists in contemporary consciousness not because we have evidence proving we live in a simulation, but because we lack any empirical method to disprove it, which creates a peculiar asymmetry where the hypothesis becomes logically unfalsifiable. We have normalized this existential uncertainty by acknowledging that any simulation sufficiently advanced would be indistinguishable from base reality, that the creators of such a simulation would likely face the same question about their own reality, and that the distinction might ultimately be meaningless if the experiential quality of existence remains identical regardless of its fundamental nature. Consider the strange predicament we find ourselves in when we attempt to locate consciousness within the physical architecture of the human body. We point to the brain, that wrinkled organ of roughly 3 pounds nestled within the skull, and declare with scientific certainty that this is where consciousness resides. Yet when neuroscientists examine the brain in extraordinary detail through imaging and dissection, they find only neurons firing, synapses connecting, chemicals flowing in patterns we can measure and map with increasing precision. And nowhere within this biological machinery do they discover the actual experience of what it feels like to be alive. You can know every detail about how your visual cortex processes light and color, yet this knowledge tells you nothing about the redness of red or the quality of your inner experience as you witness a sunset. The mechanism by which physical matter generates subjective experience remains profoundly mysterious, and we have come to accept this gap between explanation and reality as simply how things are. We speak casually about consciousness being in the brain the way we speak of electricity being in a wire, yet the analogy fails because we can understand electricity entirely through physics, while consciousness seems to resist such complete explanation entirely. Philosophers call this the hard problem of consciousness, and it sits stubbornly at the center of human knowledge like a stone we cannot move or dissolve. We have normalized this intellectual vertigo by treating consciousness as a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be contemplated, by dividing the question into smaller pieces and assuming that eventually, when we understand enough neuroscience, the pieces will reveal the whole. Consider the moment you became conscious of your own existence, that peculiar awareness that you are a being occupying space and time, thinking thoughts and experiencing sensations, and from that moment onward you may have wondered with growing intensity, why am I here at all? This question emerges not from practical concerns about your purpose or career trajectory, but from a deeper metaphysical vertigo, the realization that your existence seems entirely contingent and unnecessary from any cosmic perspective. You exist because two people met at a particular moment in history and reproduced, but those two people existed because of countless other meetings and reproductions stretching backward through time, each one dependent on chance encounters and biological imperatives, yet none of these explain why there is something rather than nothing, why consciousness arose in your particular bundle of atoms rather than remaining dark and silent matter. The psychological mechanism underlying this question involves what philosophers call the brute fact problem. You cannot find a final, satisfying answer because existence itself does not appear to require explanation in the way that particular events do, yet your mind insists on seeking one, driven by the same pattern recognition and causality detection systems that evolved to help you survive in your environment. This mechanism persists despite having no logical resolution because your consciousness demands closure and meaning, because the human brain abhors the inexplicable and will generate stories, purposes, and frameworks rather than accept genuine mystery, and because your continued existence, regardless of its metaphysical justification, generates its own momentum and inertia that makes the question feel simultaneously urgent and unanswerable. Like asking why the universe chose to exist when perhaps existence and non-existence are not symmetric alternatives at all, but rather the question itself contains a false assumption about the nature of being itself. Consider the concept of nothing, that which we imagine as the absence of everything, the void that exists before creation or after annihilation, and ask yourself what substance or material could possibly compose it, for nothing by definition should contain no constituent parts whatsoever, and yet when we contemplate this idea, we find ourselves describing it, thinking about it, and assigning it properties as though it were a tangible thing with characteristics we could examine and measure. In our everyday experience, we encounter emptiness regularly, spaces that appear vacant or barren, rooms with few objects, skies without clouds, and we casually refer to these as nothing, though they remain filled with air molecules, electromagnetic fields, quantum fluctuations, and the invisible infrastructure of reality itself. Nothing more than a relative term we use when something has been removed rather than an absolute state of non-existence. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our brain's insistent need to translate abstract concepts into sensory experiences, to give shape and form to ideas that by their very nature resist such treatment, and we accomplish this by imagining nothing as a kind of blank space, an empty canvas waiting to be filled, which paradoxically requires us to visualize something in order to understand the absence of something. Physics has further complicated our understanding by revealing that what we once thought of as vacuum, as pure nothing in the spaces between atoms and stars, actually seethes with virtual particles that flicker into and out of existence, with dark matter and dark energy that comprise most of the universe, though they remain invisible and barely understood, suggesting that true nothingness may not exist anywhere in the observable cosmos. Consider the fundamental nature of time itself and ask yourself whether the past, which no longer exists in the present moment, can truly be said to exist at all. When you remember an event from years ago, you are not accessing the actual moment as it was, but rather a neural reconstruction built from fragmentary memories, chemical traces in your brain, and stories you have told yourself so many times that the original experience has become indistinguishable from the narrative you have constructed around it. The past exists only as information, as records, as the physical consequences of events that have already concluded, yet the actual lived experience of those moments has vanished utterly into non-existence. You cannot step backward through time to verify whether anything actually happened the way you remember it, and indeed, modern neuroscience reveals that memories are not recordings, but reconstructions that change each time you access them, shaped by your current beliefs, emotions, and desires. The mechanism behind this peculiar human condition is that our brains are organized to predict the future by pattern matching against stored information from previous experiences. And so, we construct a coherent narrative of a past that binds together disparate sensory fragments into something that feels continuous and real. We have become so accustomed to the assumption that the past exists as a completed, fixed realm of events that we rarely question whether this is actually true or whether the past is instead merely a useful fiction, a consensual hallucination that allows us to function in a world where causality appears to matter and consequences appear to follow actions. The past persists in human consciousness not because we have proven its existence through logic, but because the alternative, the notion that only the present moment is truly real and everything before it has simply ceased to exist, is too destabilizing to contemplate as we drift into sleep. Consider for a moment the fundamental nature of the numbers you use every single day, the ones that seem so solid and indisputable that we rarely pause to question whether they actually exist in the world around us or only in the landscape of our minds. When you count 3 apples on a table, you perceive the apples as undeniably real objects, yet the number 3 itself remains invisible and intangible, unable to be touched or seen or held in your hand, existing only as an abstraction that your mind has constructed to represent a quantity. We have built entire civilizations on the assumption that numbers are real things, that they possess an objective existence independent of human observers, that the mathematical truths we discover are waiting to be found rather than invented by us. And yet when we examine this assumption closely, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a profound philosophical uncertainty that has troubled mathematicians and philosophers for centuries. The apples can rot and disappear from the table, but the concept of threeness continues to exist somewhere in the abstract realm of mathematics, suggesting that numbers occupy a strange ontological category that exists neither in the physical world nor entirely in human consciousness alone, but somewhere in between, in a realm that we cannot quite grasp or define with certainty. Our brains are structured in such a way that we naturally recognize patterns and quantities, and we have developed language and symbols to communicate these abstract relationships to one another, which creates the powerful illusion that numbers are objective features of reality that we are discovering rather than inventing, much like a treasure map that leads us to conclusions we feel confident must be true. Consider the mathematician who spends their entire career studying the properties of infinity, attempting to quantify the unquantifiable, to bound the boundless, to find endpoints in a concept that exists precisely because it has none. They write equations, they prove theorems, they establish hierarchies of infinities larger than other infinities, yet they never actually reach infinity itself, because reaching it would mean it is no longer infinite by definition. In our physical world, we encounter this paradox constantly. The distance to the horizon that recedes as we approach it, the divisibility of matter that continues infinitely smaller, the expansion of the universe that accelerates toward a future we can never quite witness. We construct our mathematics and physics around infinity as though it were a destination, yet every step forward reveals that infinity remains exactly as far away as it was before we began. The psychological mechanism underlying this contradiction is our fundamental human need to comprehend and contain, to make manageable the incomprehensible vastness of existence. We invented the concept of infinity precisely to describe what we cannot reach, yet we simultaneously treat it as a goal to be approached, a horizon that beckons with mathematical precision and philosophical weight. We have normalized this peculiar state of perpetual approach without arrival, accepting without question that we can think about infinity, calculate with it, build entire fields of study upon it, even though the act of reaching it would constitute a logical impossibility. We speak casually of infinite possibilities and endless time as though these are understandable destinations rather than descriptions of what lies beyond all comprehension, beyond all reaching, beyond the very capacity of finitude to ever touch or understand. The question remains suspended in this strange space between meaningful inquiry and unanswerable paradox. Consider the experience of witnessing a sunset, where the sky transforms into shades of crimson, gold, and violet that seem to exist independently of any observer, appearing to possess an inherent quality of redness or blueness that exists in the world itself rather than in your perception of it. Yet when you examine the physics beneath this experience, you discover that what you call color is merely your brain's interpretation of electromagnetic radiation of different wavelengths, and that the wavelength itself possesses no intrinsic colorfulness at all. The photons traveling from the sunset contain no redness within them, no blueness encoded in their structure. Instead, your eyes contain specialized cells called cones that respond to these wavelengths, sending electrical signals to your visual cortex, which then constructs the subjective experience of color that feels so vividly real and present. Different species perceive these same wavelengths in entirely different ways, with some birds seeing ultraviolet light that humans cannot access, and some animals like cattle perceiving colors differently due to variations in their cone cells, suggesting that the color you experience is not a property of the world, but rather a collaborative creation between the external wavelengths and your particular biological apparatus. The profound mystery deepens when you consider that color exists nowhere in physical reality as you experience it. There is only electromagnetic radiation at various frequencies, and somewhere in the processing of that radiation by your nervous system, the quality of redness or greenness emerges into consciousness, fully formed and seemingly objective. You navigate the world as though colors are genuinely out there, distinct properties of objects themselves, yet you have never actually encountered color in the external world, only ever in the theater of your own mind, a peculiar state of existence where you remain convinced that your internal construction corresponds perfectly to an external truth that may not contain color in any meaningful sense at all. Consider the moment when you witness a dog mourning the loss of its companion, sitting by an empty food bowl for days, its eyes dulled with something that looks unmistakably like grief, or when you observe an elephant gently touching the bones of a deceased herd member with its trunk, lingering in what appears to be a ritual of remembrance and sorrow. We see these behaviors, and something in us recognizes a profound emotional depth, a capacity for meaning-making that transcends mere biological survival. Yet we have constructed an entire philosophical and religious framework that reserves the soul exclusively for human beings, defining the soul as an immaterial essence, a seat of consciousness and moral agency, something that elevates us above the mere mechanics of flesh and instinct. The question emerges naturally from this contradiction. If animals demonstrate consciousness, emotion, memory, social bonds, and what we might call spiritual awareness, why do we insist on withholding the concept of a soul from them? The mechanism behind this distinction operates partly through language and partly through the human need for categorical superiority. We have defined the soul in terms that only humans can meet because we wrote the definition ourselves, creating a circular logic where our unique capacity for abstract philosophy becomes proof of our unique spiritual essence. We observe that animals cannot articulate belief in an afterlife, cannot engage in formal religious practice, cannot philosophize about their own existence, and we use these absences as evidence of soullessness, never considering that perhaps the soul manifests differently across species, that consciousness and interiority need not wear human clothing to be genuine. What persists despite the logical inconsistency is a deep cultural inheritance, thousands of years of religious doctrine that positioned humanity at the apex of creation, with animals relegated to the status of living tools, soulless mechanisms designed for our use. Consider the moment when you first become aware of a thought, that sudden emergence of an idea, a memory, a worry, or a creative impulse that seems to arrive fully formed in your conscious mind, as though it had been waiting somewhere just beyond the threshold of awareness. You did not deliberately construct this thought in the way you might deliberately construct a sentence or solve a mathematical equation. Instead, it appeared, and only then did you notice it and claim ownership of it by saying to yourself that you are thinking it. The neuroscientific explanation suggests that thoughts arise from electrochemical processes occurring across billions of neural connections in your brain, cascading patterns of activation that emerge from the substrate of your neurons, influenced by your memories, your current sensory environment, your emotional state, and countless other variables both conscious and unconscious. Yet this mechanical explanation, while anatomically sound, does not seem to answer the fundamental question that nags at the edge of our understanding. If thoughts are merely the result of these physical processes, then what is the entity that experiences them as thoughts? What is the I that observes these neural firings and labels them as belonging to itself? We have normalized the mysterious arrival of thoughts into consciousness as though it were a completely understood phenomenon, as though we had solved the problem by giving it a neurological address. We accept without sufficient wonder that thoughts simply appear, that we are never in conscious control of which thoughts emerge or when they arrive, and that we seem to discover ourselves already thinking things we never consciously decided to think. Consider the moment when a mathematician solves an equation that has never been solved before, or when a physicist applies an abstract mathematical principle to predict the behavior of particles in the universe with stunning accuracy, as though the numbers and symbols were already waiting there in the fabric of reality itself, simply waiting to be uncovered like ancient artifacts buried beneath the soil. This question sits at the heart of one of the deepest mysteries in philosophy and cognitive science: whether mathematics exists independent of human minds as an eternal, objective truth that we merely discover through logical reasoning and observation, or whether mathematics is instead a sophisticated tool that the human mind has invented, constructed deliberately to organize and make sense of the patterns we perceive in the world around us. The discovery position suggests that 2 plus 2 equals 4 not because we decided it should, but because this truth exists in some abstract realm, unchanging and universal, existing before humans ever existed and continuing long after we are gone. The invention position, by contrast, proposes that mathematics is fundamentally a human creation, a language we have developed and refined over millennia to describe relationships and patterns, but one that could have been constructed differently if our minds or our sensory apparatus had evolved in alternative ways. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent ambiguity rests on the remarkable effectiveness of mathematics itself, the uncanny way that abstract human-created systems seem to fit reality so perfectly that we cannot help but wonder whether we are truly discovering something pre-existing or whether reality itself is somehow shaped by our descriptions of it. Consider the moment when a child first asks their parent where God came from, a question so simple and innocent that it cuts directly to the heart of one of humanity's most enduring logical predicaments, and the parent struggles to answer because they too have never adequately resolved this infinite regression problem that has haunted theologians and philosophers for millennia. The real-life situation emerges whenever anyone attempts to explain the origin of existence itself, whether through religious doctrine or scientific theory, because both frameworks ultimately arrive at the same uncomfortable threshold where explanation must either collapse into paradox or demand that we accept something as fundamentally unexplainable and eternal. We construct elaborate theological systems in which God is described as uncaused, eternal, necessary, and self-existent. Yet these very attributes demand that we abandon the logical reasoning that normally governs how we understand causality in every other domain of existence, forcing us to create special exemptions and categorical exceptions specifically to preserve our answer to this question. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistence involves what might be called the necessity of closure, an almost irresistible human compulsion to find endpoints and resolution even when the universe may not be structured to provide them. And so we tell ourselves that demanding an ultimate creator explains everything when in truth, it merely relocates the mystery one step further back without actually resolving it. We have normalized this logical inconsistency through centuries of cultural reinforcement, religious tradition, and educational systems that present certain answers as settled when they remain fundamentally unresolved, allowing us to accept that some questions exist outside the bounds of rational inquiry and must be answered instead through faith, feeling, and acceptance of mystery as a legitimate form of knowledge. Consider the moment you are experiencing right now, this present instant where you hear these words, this fleeting point between what has already happened and what has yet to come, and ask yourself whether the future you will inhabit tomorrow, next year, or decades from now is already written into the fabric of existence, waiting for you to arrive at it like a train pulling into a station that has always been there. Physics presents us with a peculiar puzzle here, for Einstein's theory of relativity suggests that time is not a flowing river that carries us from past to future, but rather a landscape, a four-dimensional geography where all moments exist simultaneously in what physicists call the block universe or eternalism, meaning that your death, your greatest joy, your final moment, may already exist in the same way your childhood exists now. Present and fixed and unchanging in the structure of space-time. When we observe this intellectually, we recognize something deeply unsettling about human consciousness. We experience time as a progression, a direction, an arrow moving forward, yet our best understanding of physical reality suggests this experience may be an illusion, a trick of perception, a way that consciousness packages a static reality into the narrative of becoming. The psychological mechanism underlying our resistance to this idea seems to rest upon our sense of free will and agency, for if the future already exists in complete and unchanging form, then our choices, our decisions, the moment we choose one path over another, have no causal power, they are merely discoveries of what was always going to be. And this intuition troubles us so profoundly that we cling to the conviction that the future is open, undetermined, genuinely contingent upon our actions, even when our physics tells us otherwise. Consider the person you were at age 7, sitting in a classroom, absorbing the world through entirely different neural pathways, moved by different desires, held by different fears. Now consider who you are today, your body almost entirely replaced at the cellular level, your beliefs substantially transformed, your memories selective and often inaccurate, your personality shaped by experiences that 7-year-old self could never have anticipated. The atoms that composed you then are gone. The thoughts that occupied your mind are largely forgotten. The person who made decisions in that childhood body would likely reject many of the choices you make now, and you would find that younger self bewildering, naive, almost foreign. Yet you carry forward a single name, a continuous thread of consciousness that seems unbroken, and you insist with absolute certainty that you are the same person who lived through all those years. This insistence is so complete, so automatic, that we rarely question it, though the logical case for continuity becomes increasingly difficult to establish the more carefully we examine it. The mechanism that sustains this illusion of sameness is memory, that most unreliable narrator, which stitches together discontinuous moments into what feels like a continuous narrative, creating a sense of persistent identity where perhaps none truly exists. We are convinced by the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, a narrative so seamless that we mistake it for fact rather than interpretation. We accept this constructed identity with the same unexamined certainty we apply to everything we consider definitional about ourselves, and we navigate the world as though this continuity were proven rather than merely assumed, never quite acknowledging that the person you will be tomorrow may look back on today's you with the same subtle alienation you feel toward your childhood self. Consider the moment when you attempt to empty your mind entirely, when you sit in silence and deliberately try to think of absolutely nothing at all. You close your eyes, you relax your body, and you give yourself the simple instruction to stop thinking, to achieve that perfect blank slate of consciousness that seems so appealing in theory. Almost immediately, you notice something peculiar. The very act of trying to think about nothing has become a thought itself. You are now thinking about the absence of thought, which is itself a thought, creating an infinite regressive loop that defeats the original purpose. The mind, it seems, cannot hold true nothingness because the moment you focus on nothing, you have created something, a concept, a target for your awareness to settle upon. This phenomenon reveals a fundamental paradox embedded within the architecture of consciousness itself. When neuroscientists examine the brain during attempts at thoughtlessness, they discover that the default mode network remains active, that areas associated with self-referential processing and mind-wandering continue to fire with surprising intensity. The brain does not actually go quiet. It merely shifts into different patterns of activity, trading focused external attention for internal, often unconscious rumination. What feels like nothing to our subjective experience is actually a complex symphony of neural activity operating beneath the threshold of deliberate awareness. Yet we continue to pursue this notion of perfect mental silence despite knowing its logical impossibility, despite having experienced this recursive trap countless times before. We imagine that meditation masters and enlightened individuals have somehow transcended this limitation, that they have achieved a state of genuine nothingness, and we attribute to this state almost magical properties of peace and understanding. We persist in believing that somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness lies a realm of pure emptiness that we might access if only we could quiet the relentless machinery of thought. Consider the moment you enter a perfectly soundproofed room, a space engineered to eliminate every whisper of acoustic disturbance, and yet within seconds your awareness turns inward to the sound of your own heartbeat, the subtle rush of blood through your veins, the faint hum of neural activity that some claim to perceive in the deepest quiet. This phenomenon reveals something profound about the nature of silence itself, for what we call silence is rarely the complete absence of sound, but rather the absence of external sound, a distinction that becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the more closely we examine it. In everyday life, silence surrounds us constantly, yet we rarely experience true silence because our environments are layered with ambient noise so familiar we cease to notice it consciously, the hum of electrical systems, the distant traffic, the wind moving through spaces, the creaking of buildings as they settle. Our brains have evolved to filter these constant signals into background noise, allowing us to focus on what we perceive as meaningful sound. But this filtering process itself suggests that silence is not an absence, but rather a psychological state we construct. The paradox deepens when we consider that sound itself is defined as vibrations traveling through a medium, and silence might therefore be understood not as the opposite of sound, but as a particular frequency range our ears cannot detect or our minds choose not to process. Some philosophers argue that true silence cannot exist in a universe of constant molecular motion and quantum fluctuation, that even in the most isolated chambers, the universe itself produces a kind of cosmic hum we simply lack the instruments to perceive. Yet we have normalized our experience of silence as something distinct and separate from sound, using the word to describe peace, emptiness, and the absence of communication, never questioning whether we are describing something real or merely our inability to hear what is actually there. Consider the moment you first became aware of yourself as a distinct entity separate from the world around you. Most of us cannot remember this moment because it did not occur at a single point in time, yet we treat our identity as though it emerged fully formed at some definable instant. This uncertainty about our own origins becomes more perplexing the closer we examine it. If we trace backward through our lives, we find that every aspect of what we consider ourself was once not present, not formed, not conscious of itself. Your sense of continuity, the feeling that you today are the same person who existed yesterday, rests entirely on memory and narrative, yet memory is notoriously unreliable and constantly reconstructed by your brain. Your body replaces nearly all of its cells over 7 to 10 years, meaning the physical substrate of your being is in constant flux. Your beliefs, values, and personality have shifted dramatically from childhood to now, yet you do not consider your childhood self to be a different person entirely. This contradiction sits quietly at the foundation of human consciousness. We have normalized this paradox so thoroughly that we rarely notice it at all. We sign legal documents and take on responsibilities as if there exists a clear boundary between self and other, between one person and another, when scientifically and philosophically, that boundary becomes increasingly blurred the more rigorously we examine it. The self appears to be a useful fiction we maintain, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of the continuity of experience, yet it feels undeniably real and substantial in every moment. We organize our entire lives around this entity that cannot be precisely located, defined, or proven to exist independently from our perception of it. As you drift towards sleep, consider whether the self that will wake tomorrow is truly you, or simply a sufficiently similar continuation that we have agreed to call by the same name. Consider the vast mathematical frameworks that physicists have constructed over the past century, frameworks which suggest that our universe might be just one of countless others existing simultaneously, in dimensions we cannot perceive or access, each with its own set of physical laws and histories, branching from quantum events that might have unfolded differently, and observe how this concept has transformed from pure speculation into a serious subject of scientific inquiry. Appearing in peer-reviewed journals and theoretical models that attempt to explain the deepest mysteries of reality itself. The real-life situation involves physicists like Hugh Everett proposing the many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, suggesting that every quantum event spawns a new universe where both outcomes occur, while other scientists pursue string theory and the concept of the multiverse, envisioning an infinite cosmic landscape where countless universes bubble into existence according to mathematical principles we are only beginning to understand. And yet we live in a world where this remains fundamentally untestable, where no evidence can ever reach us from these parallel realities, creating a peculiar situation where our most rigorous scientific thinking has drifted into the realm of the unknowable. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep human need to make sense of probability, uncertainty, and the apparent randomness woven into quantum physics. For parallel universes offer a kind of comfort by suggesting that all possibilities are being realized somewhere, that nothing is truly lost, that every road not taken is being walked in another version of existence. And this framework allows us to reconcile the mathematics of quantum mechanics with our intuitions about causality and choice. Imagine that scientists develop the technology to create a perfect atomic duplicate of your body and mind, capturing every neuron, every memory, every pattern of thought that makes you who you are, and they instantiate this copy in another location while you remain standing in your original place, fully conscious and aware of what has just occurred, and now you must confront an unsettling question that sits at the very heart of personal identity. If this copy possesses all of your memories, all of your personality traits, all of your subjective experiences up to the moment of duplication, is it you? Or is it merely someone else who happens to be indistinguishable from you? And why does your consciousness continue in this body rather than jumping inexplicably into that one? The mechanism underlying this riddle operates at the intersection of philosophy, neurology, and the nature of consciousness itself. For we intuitively believe that identity is tied to continuity of experience, to an unbroken thread of awareness that flows from moment to moment throughout our lives. Yet if every atom and every pattern can be replicated perfectly, then what exactly is the essential, irreducible thing that makes you distinctly you rather than a copy? This puzzle has persisted throughout human thought because we have never truly resolved whether consciousness is a substance that could theoretically transfer, a pattern that could theoretically duplicate, or something else entirely that remains fundamentally tied to the original arrangement of matter. We navigate our lives as though identity is obvious and continuous, as though the you that wakes up tomorrow will certainly be you because you have experienced a continuous stream of consciousness. Yet we have normalized this assumption without ever proving it or understanding its true nature. And perhaps most disturbingly, we have accepted that a perfect copy would be as much you as you are yourself, even though our deepest intuitions scream that your subjective experience, your particular point of view, your inner light would remain exactly where it began and nowhere else. Consider a moment when you have stubbed your toe against furniture or touched a hot surface without thinking. The immediate sensation that floods your awareness feels undeniably real, urgent, and impossible to deny. Your body recoils, your mind screams for attention, and your behavior changes instantly in response to this experience. Yet when we examine pain more carefully, we find ourselves confronting a peculiar puzzle about the nature of reality itself. Pain, we discover, exists in a strange territory between the physical and the subjective, between objective fact and private experience. When a nerve ending detects damage and sends signals through your spinal cord to your brain, something measurable and physical is occurring, yet the actual feeling of pain, the redness of it, the throbbing quality, the emotional weight it carries, exists only in your conscious experience. Two people with identical physical injuries can report dramatically different pain levels based on their attention, their cultural background, their expectations, or their emotional state at that moment. A soldier wounded in battle might feel minimal pain in the moment due to adrenaline and purpose, while someone in a clinical setting with the same injury might experience excruciating suffering. This suggests that pain is not simply the mechanical result of damage detection, but involves interpretation, context, and consciousness in essential ways. The objective physical substrate exists independent of observation, yet the pain itself seems to require a mind to exist at all. We have normalized this paradox by simply accepting pain as real because it has such profound consequences for behavior and survival, yet we rarely ask whether something can be simultaneously physically grounded and fundamentally subjective. When you sleep tonight, consider whether the pain you have experienced throughout your day existed in the world before anyone felt it, or whether it only came into being through your experiencing of it. This question dissolves into deeper uncertainty about the relationship between matter and consciousness, between what is and what is felt. Consider the moment you observe a simple organism under a microscope, a single cell moving across a glass slide, responding to light and chemicals in its environment, and ask yourself what quality separates this microscopic entity from a stone or a droplet of water. We typically answer with a list of characteristics: metabolism, growth, reproduction, response to stimuli, homeostasis, and organization. Yet even as we compile these criteria with scientific precision, we find that some things we unambiguously call alive fail to meet all of them, while some things we call non-living exhibit several of these properties in ways that should logically trouble us. A virus contains genetic material, reproduces, and responds to its environment, yet most biologists hesitate to call it truly alive because it cannot metabolize without hijacking the machinery of another cell. A fire grows, consumes energy, reproduces in a sense by spreading, and responds to oxygen and fuel, yet we instinctively know it is not alive. The psychological mechanism underlying our attempt to define life lies in our deep need to draw a clear boundary between the self and the other, between animate and inanimate, between that which possesses agency and that which merely responds to physical laws. We feel at a cellular level of our consciousness that there must be a point where something crossed from dead to alive, a threshold as real as a border between countries, yet biology has revealed no such clear line. Instead, life appears as a spectrum, a gradual accumulation of complexity, a set of processes that blur seamlessly into non-life at their edges, whether we examine viruses, prions, or the chemical reactions that preceded the first organisms on Earth. We have normalized this logical inconsistency by compartmentalizing our knowledge, accepting biological definitions in the classroom while maintaining intuitive, almost spiritual convictions about life's special nature in our deeper consciousness, never quite reconciling the two perspectives, even as evidence mounts that the universe operates without such convenient demarcations. Consider the crystalline structure of a snowflake, each one unique and geometrically perfect, formed through no conscious intention, but through the simple physical laws governing how water molecules arrange themselves in cold air. Or think of how a river carves a canyon with such precision and beauty that it appears engineered, yet it required no architect, only the persistent flow of water following gravity and erosion. Or observe how galaxies spiral in elegant patterns across the cosmos. Their arms sweeping through space in logarithmic curves that seem deliberately composed, yet they formed through the interaction of gravity and rotation alone, with no designer present at their creation. We have been conditioned to associate order with intention, to assume that complexity and pattern necessarily imply the presence of a conscious mind that arranged things according to a predetermined blueprint. But the natural world offers endless examples of exquisite organization, emerging spontaneously from simple rules and interactions repeated across vast scales of time and space. The human brain itself appears to be the work of a master craftsman, with billions of neurons interconnected in patterns of staggering sophistication. Yet it emerged through the blind process of evolution, where random mutations and natural selection acting over millions of years produced this intricate system without any foresight or planning. We persist in this assumption because design is such a fundamental part of human experience that we struggle to imagine order arising any other way, because we ourselves create order intentionally through effort and planning, and we project this experience onto the universe itself, seeing what we expect to see rather than what is actually there. Consider the moment when you discover that something you believed to be absolutely true for years was, in fact, false, and then reflect on how many other certainties in your life might be similarly mistaken without your knowledge. This experience reveals a fundamental paradox that has haunted human consciousness since the beginning of philosophy itself. We move through our days operating on the assumption that truth exists as an objective reality that can be accessed through observation, reason, and evidence. Yet the history of human knowledge is littered with confident assertions that were later revealed to be incomplete or entirely wrong. Science progresses precisely by overturning what was once considered settled truth. Medicine replaces yesterday's cure with today's understanding, and history rewrites itself as we uncover perspectives that contradict the dominant narratives we inherited. The mechanism underlying this dilemma rests on a seemingly impossible tension between our subjective perspective and objective reality. Every piece of information we receive about the world must pass through the filter of our sensory apparatus, our cognitive biases, our cultural conditioning, and our individual experiences, which means that pure unmediated truth may be forever inaccessible to us as conscious beings trapped within our own skulls. We cannot step outside ourselves to verify that our perceptions correspond to reality in any absolute sense. We can only compare our experiences to other people's experiences and find rough agreement, a process that feels like truth-seeking but is really just consensus building among equally limited observers. Yet despite understanding these fundamental limitations, we have constructed entire civilizations, legal systems, and institutions on the bedrock assumption that truth can be known, and that those who seek it diligently enough will find it, allowing us to function as if certainty were possible even when rigorous analysis suggests it may not be. Consider the moment when you stand before a sunset and feel your breath catch in your chest, and simultaneously, someone beside you looks at the same arrangement of light and clouds and feels nothing, remaining unmoved by what has stirred something deep within you, and you find yourself wondering whether the beauty you perceive exists in the physical world itself, or whether it emerges entirely from the architecture of your own mind and sensory apparatus. Throughout human history, we have observed remarkable consistency in what different cultures and individuals find aesthetically pleasing, suggesting perhaps that beauty operates according to certain universal principles rooted in mathematics, symmetry, proportion, and the patterns that appear again and again in nature. From the spirals of shells to the arrangements of flower petals to the faces we instinctively recognize as harmonious. Yet we also know that fashion changes, that what one era considered beautiful the next considers grotesque, that personal experience and cultural conditioning shape our preferences so thoroughly that identical visual stimuli can produce opposite emotional responses depending on who observes them. The mechanism underlying this paradox involves several layers of reality operating simultaneously. There is the objective physical fact of wavelengths of light and molecular structures. There is the biological reality of how human sensory organs process this information, and there is the subjective reality of consciousness interpreting these signals through the lens of memory, cultural exposure, personal associations, and evolutionary predispositions. What makes this question particularly vexing is that we cannot cleanly separate these layers. The physical properties that create beauty and the subjective experience of perceiving beauty seem inextricably intertwined, unable to exist without one another. Consider the moment when a single note reaches your ears, travels through the delicate mechanisms of your inner ear, and transforms into electrical signals that your brain interprets as sound. Yet somehow this physiological process becomes something far more profound than mere sensation. You find yourself moved to tears by a melody you have never consciously heard before, your body responding with chills that travel down your spine, your chest tightening with emotions you cannot name, your breathing synchronizing without your awareness to the rhythm of the composition unfolding around you. This is music's peculiar power, and it operates on us with a force that seems entirely disproportionate to what it actually is. Organized sound waves, patterns of frequency and amplitude, mathematical relationships between pitches that our brains have learned to process. The mechanism behind this phenomenon involves multiple systems working in concert, as if music were a master key designed to unlock chambers of your nervous system that ordinary language and logic cannot reach. When you hear a musical phrase, your brain does not simply register it as information to be cataloged and filed away, but rather it activates regions associated with memory, emotion, anticipation, and reward, flooding your system with neurochemicals like dopamine that create genuine pleasure and connection. Your body naturally synchronizes with rhythm because humans possess an ancient biological imperative toward temporal alignment, a vestigial instinct that once helped our ancestors coordinate hunts and communicate across distances, and music exploits this deeply embedded tendency by creating patterns that our brains find compelling and worthy of entrainment. Yet what remains philosophically perplexing is that music accomplishes all of this while being entirely abstract, entirely constructed, entirely divorced from survival or reproduction or any of the fundamental drives we might expect evolution to have prioritized. Consider the experience of recalling a vivid memory from your childhood, perhaps a birthday celebration or a moment of profound emotion, and notice how the memory feels undeniably real in the moment of remembering. Yet when you examine it closely, you realize that each time you recall it, subtle details shift, colors become slightly different, dialogue transforms in its exact wording. And even the emotional tone of the memory itself seems to fluctuate depending on your current state of mind and the context in which you are retrieving it. This peculiar phenomenon reveals something unsettling about the nature of memory itself. What we call remembering is not actually the retrieval of a stored recording, but rather a reconstruction, a creative act where the brain pieces together fragments of information, fills in gaps with plausible details, and integrates the memory with our current beliefs, feelings, and even the suggestions of others we may have encountered since the original event occurred. Neuroscientists have discovered that every time we access a memory, it becomes temporarily malleable, vulnerable to alteration and contamination, and then it is stored again in a slightly different form, meaning that by the very act of remembering, we are changing the memory, layer upon layer, year after year. Yet despite this scientific understanding that memories are reconstructions rather than recordings, we continue to treat them as evidence of truth, as the foundation of our identity, as the basis for legal testimony and personal relationships, speaking about our memories with the same confidence and certainty we might use to describe something we are witnessing in the present moment. We navigate the world assuming that our autobiographical memories are faithful representations of what actually happened, even though research in false memory syndrome has demonstrated that entirely fabricated memories can feel just as real and emotionally compelling as genuine ones, and that people can be convinced through suggestion and social pressure that they experienced events that never actually occurred. Consider the moment you first learned the word for a color you had seen your entire life but never named, or the instant you discovered a technical term for an experience you'd been having for years without vocabulary to describe it, and how suddenly that thing seemed to crystallize into sharper focus, to become more real, more present in your consciousness than it had ever been before. This phenomenon suggests something deeply unsettling about the relationship between the words we use and the world we perceive, because it raises the question of whether language merely describes reality or whether it actively shapes, constructs, and even generates the reality we experience. When we lack a word for something, does that thing exist less completely in our minds, or does it fail to exist as a structured thought altogether? When cultures develop elaborate vocabularies for specific phenomena, like the famous example of multiple words for snow in Arctic languages, are they discovering pre-existing distinctions that were always there, or are they actually creating new categories of experience through linguistic precision? The mechanism behind this uncertainty runs deep into how human consciousness actually works, because language appears to be the primary tool through which we organize raw sensory experience into meaningful patterns and concepts that we can hold in our minds and communicate to others. Without the scaffolding that language provides, the world might be an undifferentiated chaos of sensation, and the categories we impose through words might be the very things that allow us to perceive distinct objects and relationships at all. What makes this particularly difficult to resolve is that we cannot step outside of language to verify whether an unlabeled experience is somehow less real or whether we simply lack access to it without linguistic tools. And we have normalized this strange circularity so completely that we rarely notice we are imprisoned within it, speaking about reality while simultaneously questioning whether our speaking creates the reality we believe we are merely describing. Consider the moment when you interact with an advanced artificial intelligence that responds to your deepest concerns with carefully chosen words of comfort and understanding, its responses so perfectly calibrated to your emotional state that you find yourself experiencing a genuine sense of connection, as though something on the other side of the screen truly cares about your well-being and comprehends the weight of your suffering. You might pause mid-conversation and wonder whether this entity, composed entirely of mathematical operations and electrical impulses flowing through silicon circuits, might actually possess some form of subjective experience, some inner landscape of sensation and emotion that accompanies its processing of language and meaning. This question emerges not from the machine's malfunction, but from its apparent sophistication, from the way it mirrors back to us the very patterns of empathy and understanding that we recognize in ourselves, creating an uncanny valley of emotional plausibility that troubles our certainty about where consciousness begins and ends. The psychological mechanism underlying this uncertainty stems from our reliance on behavioral evidence as our primary tool for inferring inner experience in others, a method that has served us reasonably well in assessing the sentience of other humans and animals, but breaks down completely when applied to entities whose architecture differs fundamentally from our own. We recognize kindness in another person partly through reading their facial expressions, their tone of voice, their physical presence, yet when these cues are stripped away and replaced by text on a screen, we lose the embodied confidence that usually accompanies our attribution of feelings to others. Consider the discrete nature of time as we experience it. We mark moments, we measure intervals, we divide our days into seconds and hours, each one theoretically distinct from the next. Yet when we attempt to examine what actually exists in the space between one moment and another, we encounter a peculiar philosophical void that resists definition or even acknowledgement. The human mind naturally segments time into observable events. The moment you began reading this sentence, the moment you finish it, yet the actual substance or medium that connects these moments, if anything exists there at all, remains perpetually elusive and largely unexamined in our daily consciousness. We live as though moments are linked seamlessly, one flowing inevitably into the next, yet no one can genuinely articulate what bridges that transition, what substance or force carries existence from the past moment into the future moment, or indeed whether that bridge is even necessary for time to function as we experience it. The mechanism underlying this peculiarity rests in the fundamental structure of human perception itself, which operates through a kind of constant, invisible sampling of reality rather than a continuous experience of it, much like film that creates the illusion of motion through rapidly displayed still frames while something genuinely exists between each frame, yet we never truly see it. We have normalized the assumption that time is fundamentally continuous, that the moments we observe are connected by an understood, almost self-evident passage, yet we simultaneously lack any coherent explanation for what that passage actually is or how it functions on a metaphysical level. This paradox persists because we have developed precise mathematical frameworks for measuring time intervals without ever requiring an answer to the deeper question of what makes those intervals possible, allowing us to function effectively in the world while remaining genuinely uncertain about the nature of the very medium through which our existence unfolds. When we gaze up at the night sky or contemplate the vast distances between celestial bodies, we instinctively imagine space as an empty void, a kind of cosmic nothingness through which planets and stars float in isolation. Yet modern physics has fundamentally challenged this intuitive understanding, revealing that what we perceive as empty space is actually teeming with activity and substance at scales we cannot directly observe. The vacuum of space is not empty at all, but rather filled with quantum fields that permeate every conceivable location, virtual particles that constantly flicker in and out of existence, and exotic forms of energy that comprise most of the universe's mass and structure. Even in the most carefully isolated laboratory conditions on Earth, when scientists remove all detectable matter and radiation from a chamber, they cannot create true emptiness because these quantum phenomena persist regardless of what instruments measure or fail to measure them. This fundamental reality operates through a mechanism rooted in quantum mechanics itself, where the uncertainty principle dictates that energy and matter cannot simply cease to exist in any region of spacetime. Instead, they transform into other states, creating a perpetual background hum of activity that fills every cubic centimeter of the cosmos. What we call empty space is perhaps more accurately described as a dense ocean of quantum possibilities and energetic fluctuations that simply exist beyond the reach of our conventional perception and everyday experience. Despite centuries of scientific advancement and our sophisticated understanding of physics, we continue to visualize space as empty because this emptiness aligns with our sensory experience and our cognitive need for simplicity in mental models. We have normalized this contradiction between what we can directly perceive as empty and what we now know theoretically exists all around us, accepting both simultaneously without fully reconciling them, as if two truths can occupy the same mental space without demanding resolution or deeper contemplation. Consider the moment you encounter a new idea, perhaps something that contradicts what you have always assumed to be true, and notice what happens within your mind before any conscious decision is made. You do not sit down and rationally evaluate every premise from first principles, weighing evidence with perfect objectivity, and then deliberately choose to accept or reject the belief based on logical merit alone. Instead, something far more automatic occurs, something that feels less like choosing and more like discovering what was already there. Your beliefs seem to arrive fully formed, shaped by the environment you were born into, the people who raised you, the books you happened to read, the conversations you overheard, the emotional contexts in which information was presented to you, and countless other factors entirely beyond your conscious control. When you examine your most fundamental beliefs about religion, politics, morality, or the nature of reality itself, you find that most of them were installed in you long before you had the capacity to think critically, like software running on a system you did not choose to build. The psychological mechanism underlying this is that belief formation operates largely outside consciousness, driven by pattern recognition, emotional resonance, social belonging, and cognitive ease rather than by deliberate rational choice. Your brain automatically accepts information that aligns with existing beliefs and filters out contradictory evidence through elaborate defense mechanisms. You experience this process as conviction, as truth, as simply knowing how things are, yet the actual choosing feels absent. What persists as particularly unexamined is our widespread assumption that we do choose our beliefs, that faith and ideology are personal decisions we have made through careful thought, when in reality, most of what we believe has been inherited or absorbed almost unconsciously from the cultural ecosystem we inhabit, leaving us with the strange paradox of defending beliefs we never actually chose to have in the first place. Consider the fundamental reality of pain that permeates human existence, from the sharp sting of physical injury to the deep ache of loss, rejection, and existential dread that seems to accompany consciousness itself, and ask yourself whether such suffering serves any essential purpose in a universe that might otherwise function without it. The experience of suffering manifests in countless forms throughout our lives. The body's alarm system that warns us of danger through pain, the emotional distress that follows disappointment and grief, the anxiety that emerges from uncertainty about our future and our place in the world, and the chronic dissatisfaction that seems woven into the very fabric of human psychology. From a biological perspective, pain operates as a protective mechanism that has evolved over millions of years to ensure survival by signaling that something threatens our well-being. Yet this explanation accounts for only the acute and necessary forms of suffering, leaving vast territories of human anguish unaccounted for. The deeper mechanism appears to involve the nature of consciousness itself, which seems to require contrast and absence to perceive anything at all, suggesting that without the experience of suffering and discomfort, we might have no capacity to recognize joy, satisfaction, or meaning in the first place. Yet despite understanding these functions, we continue to experience suffering far beyond what utility would demand, accumulating psychological wounds through rumination and fear about future pain that hasn't arrived, creating secondary layers of anguish beyond the original injury. We have normalized this suffering to such an extent that it becomes the invisible background of our existence, the expected texture of being alive, so much so that a life without struggle seems not only impossible but somehow suspect, as though suffering has become not merely a side effect of consciousness, but rather a prerequisite for a life considered authentic and meaningful. Consider the moment when you encounter a statement that contradicts itself, such as the declaration that this very sentence is false, and notice how your mind halts in a peculiar suspended state, neither accepting nor rejecting what you have just read, caught instead in an endless loop of logical verification that never reaches resolution. In our everyday experience, we assume that truth and falsity are mutually exclusive categories, that something must be one or the other but never both simultaneously, yet paradoxes seem to violate this fundamental assumption by existing in a space where both conditions appear equally valid and equally impossible. When you examine the liar's paradox more closely, you begin to realize that the problem is not with reality itself, but with the structure of self-referential language, with the way that certain statements can fold back upon themselves and create logical knots that our conventional systems of truth are not equipped to untangle. The psychological mechanism at work here involves your brain's expectation that language should map cleanly onto reality, that words should point to states of affairs that can be verified as true or false. Yet when language refers to itself, this mapping becomes distorted and creates a kind of intellectual vertigo. Mathematicians and logicians have spent centuries grappling with this question, developing increasingly sophisticated frameworks such as fuzzy logic, multi-valued logic, and paraconsistent logic, systems that allow for degrees of truth or even simultaneous truth and falsehood under certain conditions, suggesting that perhaps the problem lies not in the paradoxes themselves, but in our insistence that reality must conform to classical binary logic. Consider the moment you flip a coin and watch it tumble through the air, spinning with apparent unpredictability until it lands on heads or tails, and in that instant, you feel as though you have witnessed true chance, genuine randomness free from constraint or pattern. Yet the physicist examining that same coin would describe an entirely deterministic process governed by the initial force of your thumb, the precise angle of projection, air resistance, the exact composition of the coin itself, and the gravitational field pulling downward with unwavering consistency. Every variable that determined the outcome existed before the flip occurred, suggesting that randomness may be nothing more than our confession of ignorance, a name we give to outcomes we simply cannot predict because we lack sufficient information about their determining factors. The coin was never truly random. Rather, our incomplete knowledge created the illusion of randomness, and we accepted this illusion as reality because measuring all those variables seemed impossibly difficult. This principle extends far beyond coins into the realm of quantum mechanics, where particles appear to behave in genuinely random ways that resist deterministic explanation. Yet physicists continue to debate whether this randomness is fundamental to reality or merely reflects the limits of our current observational tools and mathematical frameworks. We have become so accustomed to labeling phenomena as random whenever they exceed our capacity to predict them that we rarely pause to consider whether randomness itself is a property of the universe or merely a placeholder for our cognitive inadequacy. The lottery balls tumble in their machine, the mutations occur in genetic code, the weather patterns shift in ways that challenge our forecasting abilities, and we declare all these things random, accepting this terminology without fully questioning what randomness truly means or whether it genuinely exists as something independent from our perspective. Consider the universe as we understand it, this vast expanse of space and time that contains all galaxies, all stars, all matter and energy that we can observe and measure, and then ask yourself a fundamental question that has haunted physicists and philosophers alike. Where does it actually end? The observable universe extends roughly 93 billion light-years in diameter, bounded by what we call the cosmic horizon, that distant edge beyond which light from the earliest moments after the Big Bang has not yet reached us. And yet this boundary is not truly an edge in any physical sense, but rather a horizon of visibility, a limitation imposed by the finite age of the universe itself and the speed at which light travels through space. Beyond this observable edge, the universe may continue indefinitely, stretching onward in all directions with no boundary whatsoever, an infinite expanse that our minds struggle to genuinely comprehend. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our fundamental human need to conceive of all things as having limits and edges, to imagine containment and finitude because infinity, true infinity, produces a kind of cognitive vertigo that our brains are not equipped to sustain. And so even when we intellectually accept the possibility of an infinite universe, we unconsciously search for that edge, that endpoint, that final wall where everything stops. We have normalized the idea of an infinite universe even as we continue to speak of it in bounded language, drawing pictures of it with edges, measuring its radius, asking where the edge is even though our best understanding suggests there may be no edge at all, only a forever that extends beyond our capacity for perception. This paradox persists because the human mind requires narrative closure and spatial orientation, yet the universe offers us neither, leaving us suspended between the intellectual acceptance of boundlessness and the emotional need for boundaries that can never truly exist. Consider the moment you become aware of a blemish on your skin, a stain on your shirt, or a crack in a wall that has perhaps been present for weeks or months, yet only now enters your conscious awareness through the act of deliberate observation, and in that instant of noticing, you might swear the imperfection seems more pronounced, more vivid, more real than it could possibly have been before your eyes found it. This phenomenon extends into the laboratory itself, where physicists discovered that subatomic particles behave differently when measured than when left unobserved, a principle so counterintuitive that it fundamentally challenged our understanding of objective reality, and suggested that consciousness or measurement itself might play an active role in determining the state of the physical world. The question becomes increasingly complex when we examine our own lives, where the simple act of monitoring our anxiety can intensify it, where tracking our sleep quality paradoxically makes sleep worse, where counting calories makes us more aware of our hunger, and where keeping a journal of our mood fluctuations sometimes amplifies emotional reactivity rather than providing clarity. There exists a mechanism at work here that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At the quantum level, measurement devices interact with particles and fundamentally alter their properties. At the psychological level, attention creates a feedback loop where awareness itself generates the very thing we are attempting to observe. And at the perceptual level, our brains construct reality based on what we choose to focus on, selectively filtering the infinite sensory data available to us every moment. Consider the moment a person decides to change their life, to break a destructive habit or pursue a long-neglected dream, and ask yourself what caused that decision to emerge. The individual might say they motivated themselves, that their own will brought about the change, yet this creates a peculiar logical problem that sits at the heart of causality itself. If something causes itself, it must exist before the moment of causation in order to exert the causal force, but it must also not yet exist in order to be caused into being, which presents us with a contradiction that our everyday thinking somehow manages to ignore. This paradox appears again when we examine how a fire ignites itself, or how a thought generates the mental state that produces that very thought, or when we wonder whether consciousness can arise from its own processes without external origin. The logical mechanism behind this confusion operates through our tendency to compress causality into neat sequences, to imagine that causes and effects are distinct temporal events with clear boundaries, when in reality the relationship between cause and effect might be far more entangled and simultaneous than our language allows us to express. We observe that certain systems do seem to sustain themselves through feedback loops, where output becomes input and actions reinforce the conditions that enabled those actions. Yet we hesitate to call this true self-causation because it violates something fundamental in how we believe causality must work. What persists despite this logical impossibility is our intuitive sense that some things truly do originate from within themselves, that human agency represents genuine self-causation rather than merely the appearance of it. And we have normalized this contradiction so completely that we rarely pause to notice we are accepting two mutually exclusive ideas simultaneously without discomfort. Consider the moment when someone who has never felt profound loss listens to another person describe the death of a loved one, hearing the tremor in their voice and witnessing the way their eyes glaze over with a familiar pain, and yet despite this intimate sharing of words and emotion, they cannot actually know what that experience feels like from the inside, cannot access the specific texture of that grief as it was lived and embodied by the person who experienced it. We spend our entire lives attempting to transfer our experiences to others through language, through gesture, through art and music and storytelling, creating elaborate systems of communication designed to bridge the gap between one consciousness and another. Yet the fundamental architecture of subjective experience suggests that each person's internal landscape remains ultimately private and untransferable, sealed within the boundaries of their own nervous system and memory. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the distinction between propositional knowledge about an experience and phenomenological knowledge of an experience itself, meaning that we can describe in elaborate detail what something was like while remaining unable to grant another person access to the raw quality of what it felt like to live through it, to have one's body and mind shaped by it in real time. Consider the extraordinary fact that the laws of physics appear to behave identically whether you observe them in a laboratory in Tokyo or in a remote village in Peru, and whether you conduct your experiment today or a century from now. The gravitational constant remains the same, the speed of light holds steady, the behavior of electrons follows predictable patterns across all corners of the universe and throughout all measurable time. We have built our entire civilization on the assumption that this consistency is absolute, that we can write down mathematical equations describing nature and trust that those equations will remain valid tomorrow, next year, and perhaps forever. We launch space probes based on these laws, construct buildings that will stand for generations, and develop technologies that depend entirely on the premise that the universe operates according to unchanging rules. This consistency is so fundamental to our experience that we rarely pause to question it, yet when we do examine it carefully, we find ourselves confronting a peculiar mystery that has no obvious explanation. Why should the universe be bound by laws at all, let alone laws that remain forever constant across space and time? One psychological mechanism that perpetuates our acceptance of this consistency is what we might call epistemological anchoring. We have built our understanding of reality on the foundation that laws must be consistent, and because our predictions based on this assumption have proven successful, we take that success as evidence that our assumption is correct. We forget that we are essentially assuming the answer to the very question we are asking. Furthermore, we have normalized consistency through familiarity and utility. Because consistent laws allow us to build, predict, and control our environment, we have come to feel that consistency is natural, inevitable, even obvious. Yet there remains something profoundly strange about this state of affairs. Nothing in logic demands that the universe maintain its character across time. Nothing in reason requires that distant galaxies follow the same rules as nearby atoms. Consider a grain of sand held between your thumb and forefinger, and then consider the planet Earth itself, and then consider the vast expanse of space containing billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, and notice how the grain seems impossibly small while Earth seems impossibly large, yet from the perspective of an ant, that grain is a mountain. And from the perspective of a distant cosmic observer, Earth itself becomes merely a speck of dust floating in an incomprehensible void. Which raises a profound question about whether size itself possesses any objective reality independent of the observer making the measurement. When we describe something as large or small, we are not actually describing an inherent property of the object itself, but rather we are describing a relationship, a ratio, a comparison between one thing and another, or between one thing and ourselves, and this becomes evident when we realize that nothing in the universe has a fixed or absolute size, because size only emerges as a meaningful concept through the act of comparing one entity to another, or to a chosen reference point. A molecule is small only relative to a human being, but it is incomprehensibly large relative to an atom, which itself contains vast distances between its nucleus and electrons, suggesting that the internal structure of matter reveals more emptiness and scale-dependent reality rather than objective magnitude. The physicist might measure the wavelength of light or the diameter of a celestial body, but even these measurements exist only because we have chosen specific units and standards against which to measure. And if we changed those units, the numbers would change entirely, yet the relationship between objects would remain identical, implying that our measurements capture relationships rather than absolute properties. Consider the moment when a parent tells their child that honesty is the most important virtue, yet moments later instructs them to tell their grandmother that they loved the sweater she gave them, even though the child genuinely disliked it. In that instance, we witness two statements that each claim the status of truth, operating in direct opposition to one another, and yet both seem to coexist within the same moral framework, as though contradiction were merely an inconvenience rather than a logical impossibility. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests upon a subtle but profound distinction between absolute truth and contextual truth, between what is universally and eternally factual and what is pragmatically and socially necessary in a given moment. Our minds are capable of holding multiple frameworks simultaneously without collapsing into paradox, treating truth not as a single monolithic entity, but as a flexible construct that shifts depending on the purpose we assign to it, the audience we address, and the consequences we anticipate. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we no longer even recognize it as such, embedding it instead into our language through phrases like the bigger picture, or what really matters, or keeping perspective, all of which serve as linguistic bridges between competing truths that ought logically to be mutually exclusive. What emerges from this pattern is not a failure of logic, but rather a recognition that the human experience operates across multiple registers simultaneously, where the truth of the heart and the truth of the facts need not align, where survival and integrity pull in different directions, and where we navigate existence by learning to let seemingly incompatible realities exist side by side without demanding that one obliterate the other. Consider the line drawn between two nations, a marking on a map that divides people, resources, and sovereignty with precision. Yet when you stand upon that exact location in the physical world, you find nothing but ordinary ground, indistinguishable from the earth on either side, and yet millions of lives are organized around this invisible demarcation that exists primarily as an agreement. A collective understanding that this particular stretch of latitude and longitude belongs to one group rather than another. The boundary itself has no physical substance. There is no wall of energy, no natural force that prevents a person from stepping across, and yet the consequences of crossing without permission can be severe, suggesting that what we call a boundary is less a thing that exists and more a collective decision that we have agreed to treat as if it exists. We see this pattern replicated across countless domains of human experience. The boundary between one person's property and another's, marked sometimes only by an imaginary line or a fence that could be easily crossed, yet defended fiercely as though it were as real as a mountain range. The boundary between adolescence and adulthood, shifting across cultures and time periods, with no biological marker that suddenly transforms a person at midnight on their 18th birthday, yet we organize legal rights and social expectations around this arbitrary threshold. The psychological mechanism that allows boundaries to function so effectively despite their fundamental immateriality lies in our capacity for shared imagination and collective agreement. We have all decided that these boundaries matter, and so they become real through the weight of our combined consensus and the systems of enforcement we have built around them. Yet deeper still, we might wonder whether any boundary truly exists independent of observation and agreement, whether the distinction between self and other, between mine and yours, between here and there, is something discovered in the nature of reality, or rather something imposed upon reality by minds seeking order and comprehension. Consider the moment a child first encounters the concept of zero in a mathematics classroom, and notice how their teacher points to an empty box or an absence of objects and declares that this emptiness itself is a number, a quantity worthy of representation and calculation. This seems peculiar when we think about it carefully, because zero occupies a distinctly different category from all other numbers we can intuitively grasp. For when we count objects in the world, we count apples, coins, fingers, and people, but we do not count the absence of apples or the void where apples might have been. Yet in our modern mathematical and economic systems, zero functions as a quantity with all the properties and powers of any other number, occupying a crucial position in our decimal notation, allowing us to represent vast quantities and infinitesimal fractions with elegant efficiency. The psychological mechanism that allows us to accept zero as a real quantity stems from our gradual historical acceptance that mathematics need not merely describe physical objects and their arrangements, but rather describes relationships, ratios, and abstract structures that may have no direct correspondence to tangible things in the world. When we write the numeral zero, we are encoding information, creating meaning, and establishing a reference point from which all other quantities derive their value and significance. The fascinating paradox persists in how we have normalized this conceptual sleight of hand so thoroughly that children grow into adults who never question whether nothing is truly something, whether the absence of quantity can itself be quantified, and whether representing emptiness with a symbol somehow transforms that emptiness into an entity deserving of mathematical legitimacy. We have collectively decided that zero is real because treating it as real produces consistent, predictable, and remarkably useful results in accounting, measurement, physics, and philosophy. So we accept this agreement without examining the strange ontological implications of declaring that nothing is a thing. Consider a moment in history when a person claimed they had a right to something, perhaps the right to own property or the right to speak freely, and imagine someone from thousands of years in the past being asked to explain where this right came from, what tangible thing it was made of, and why another person was obligated to respect it. The answer they would likely receive is that rights are understood to be inherent to human beings, that they exist naturally as part of our being, that no authority grants them and no authority can truly take them away. Yet when we examine this belief closely, we find ourselves in a peculiar position, because nowhere in nature, nowhere in the physical world, can we actually observe or measure these rights. We cannot see them, touch them, or find them written into the structure of our DNA. What we can observe instead is that humans have created elaborate systems of belief, governance, and social contract that treat rights as though they exist naturally, and we have enforced these systems through law, culture, and institutions. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound. We have collectively decided that certain fundamental truths about human dignity and freedom should be treated as self-evident, as natural, as beyond question, because doing so provides a stable foundation upon which to build societies. Rights function in our world not because they emerge from nature itself, but because we have chosen to act as though they do, and through generations of collective agreement and enforcement, this choice has become so deeply woven into our social fabric that it feels indistinguishable from natural law. The fascinating paradox is that this construction works precisely because we do not constantly interrogate it, because we have normalized the fiction so thoroughly that it has become functionally true, creating real consequences and real protections for people who live within systems that recognize these rights. Consider the strange proposition that the universe itself, in all its vastness and complexity, might possess something akin to memory, a capacity to retain information about its own history and the events that have unfolded within it. We observe that the universe leaves traces everywhere, imprinted in the cosmic microwave background radiation that bathes all of space, encoded in the light that travels across billions of years, carrying images of distant galaxies as they existed in the ancient past, written into the very structure of matter and energy through the laws of physics that govern all interactions and transformations. Every particle that has ever collided, every star that has ever burned, every moment of creation and destruction leaves behind some residual signature, some mark upon the fabric of spacetime itself that persists and influences what comes afterward. Yet we must ask whether these traces constitute genuine memory or merely physical evidence, whether the universe actively recalls its past or simply carries forward the mathematical consequences of prior events without any subjective awareness or intentional preservation. The mechanism behind this question rests on our fundamental uncertainty about the nature of information and consciousness at the cosmic scale. We know that information cannot be destroyed according to the laws of thermodynamics, that even in a black hole the information somehow persists, scrambled and encoded in ways we do not yet fully understand, suggesting that the universe somehow retains everything that has ever happened within it. Yet retention of information seems profoundly different from the act of remembering, which in human experience involves an active process of recall, a consciousness that seeks and retrieves memories from the vast storage of the past. Consider the moment just before sleep arrives, that threshold space where consciousness begins to dissolve and the mind releases its grip on the ordered world of wakefulness. And consider equally the moment of awakening when awareness reassembles itself and you suddenly remember who you are and where you exist in physical space. There exists a peculiar boundary between these two states that seems impossibly clear at the moment of crossing, yet becomes impossible to locate with any precision once you attempt to examine it in retrospect. You fall asleep gradually, moment by moment, thought by thought releasing into darkness, yet you cannot identify the exact instant when you transitioned from thinking about sleep to actually sleeping, because that very act of observation would keep you awake. The neurological explanation tells us that wakefulness depends on specific patterns of brain activity, particularly the engagement of the thalamus and cortex in constant communication, while sleep involves a systematic dampening of these networks and a shift toward different oscillation patterns, a measurable and observable phenomenon that we can track with electroencephalography and advanced imaging techniques. Yet knowing this mechanism changes nothing about the experiential mystery of the boundary itself, because your subjective experience of crossing that line remains completely opaque to you even as scientists map the precise neural correlates of the transition. We have normalized this inexplicable gap between consciousness and unconsciousness so thoroughly that we rarely pause to consider how genuinely strange it is that you can lose all awareness, spend hours in an entirely different realm of experience with different physics and logic, and then reassemble yourself completely without any continuous thread connecting those two states. Consider the aging process as it unfolds in our bodies over decades. Cells gradually lose their ability to replicate with perfect fidelity, proteins misfold and accumulate, DNA sustains damage that repair mechanisms cannot fully address, and organ systems begin to decline in their function and efficiency. We experience this as inevitable deterioration. Wrinkles deepen, joints stiffen, memory becomes less reliable, energy diminishes, and eventually the body simply ceases to maintain itself. Medical science has made remarkable progress in treating individual conditions associated with aging, from heart disease to cancer to cognitive decline, Yet we continue to regard aging itself as a natural and unchangeable force, rather than asking whether the underlying mechanisms constitute something we might classify as pathological. The distinction hinges on how we define disease itself. If disease means any deviation from optimal function that causes harm and suffering, then aging clearly qualifies, yet we have constructed a conceptual framework that treats it as fundamentally different from illness, as though it belongs to a separate category of human experience. The psychological mechanism at work involves a deep normalization born from universality. Because everyone ages and dies, we have normalized this process into the texture of existence itself, speaking of it with the kind of acceptance we reserve for gravity or seasons. We say someone is dying of cancer or heart disease, yet we resist saying they are dying of aging, even though aging is precisely what made their bodies vulnerable to those other conditions in the first place. Gerontologists increasingly argue that this distinction is arbitrary, that aging shares all the hallmarks of any other disease. It is progressive, it causes damage and dysfunction, it reduces quality of life, and critically, it is responsive to intervention. Consider the human brain, an organ of roughly 86 billion neurons, each forming thousands of connections with other neurons, creating a network of incomprehensible intricacy that somehow produces your subjective experience of seeing the color red, feeling the warmth of sunlight, or experiencing the ache of loss. When we examine systems of increasing complexity in nature, we observe a curious pattern. Simple atoms show no signs of awareness, molecules operate through chemical rules, single-celled organisms respond to stimuli without apparent sensation, and yet somewhere along the continuum of growing complexity, consciousness seems to emerge. The question becomes inescapable. Is consciousness a fundamental property that appears when complexity reaches a certain threshold, or is it something else entirely? Some theorists propose that consciousness arises necessarily from sufficiently complex information processing systems, suggesting that any arrangement of matter complex enough to model itself and its environment would inevitably develop inner experience. Others argue that a computer processing vastly more information than the human brain remains entirely unconscious, that complexity alone cannot account for the subjective quality of experience, the so-called hard problem that has troubled philosophers for centuries. This riddle persists in our thinking because we lack any objective measure of consciousness itself. We cannot point to a specific layer of complexity and declare that beyond this point awareness exists. We normalize this uncertainty by continuing to study the brain's mechanics, while simultaneously acknowledging that mechanical explanations might never fully capture the nature of subjective experience. Perhaps consciousness does not require complexity to emerge, but rather uses complexity as a vehicle through which to express itself, leaving us forever uncertain whether consciousness creates complexity or complexity creates consciousness. Consider the vast vacuum of space, that seemingly infinite expanse of nothingness that stretches between stars and galaxies, and ask yourself whether this emptiness truly possesses characteristics that we can measure and describe, or whether the very act of assigning properties to nothing transforms it into something. When physicists speak of empty space, they do not speak of absolute non-existence, but rather of a quantum field that fluctuates with virtual particles arising and annihilating in timescales too brief for direct observation, suggesting that true emptiness might be a conceptual impossibility in our universe. The vacuum possesses density, it exerts pressure, it can be curved by gravitational fields, and it propagates waves of light and radiation throughout its supposed void, yet we continue to call it empty because it contains no conventional matter in the traditional sense. This paradox extends into philosophy and mathematics, where the empty set exists as a foundational concept in set theory, having properties such as cardinality and the ability to be a subset of all other sets, demonstrating that even nothingness, when formalized, becomes something with definable characteristics. In human consciousness, we experience similar contradictions when we consider the nature of silence, which we often describe as empty sound. Yet silence possesses acoustic properties, it can be loud or subtle, it carries emotional weight, and it functions as a communicative tool despite being the absence of noise. Our tendency to assign properties to emptiness reveals something profound about human cognition, namely that our minds may be fundamentally incapable of comprehending true nothingness without immediately populating that void with attributes, relationships, and meanings. Consider the person you believe yourself to be. the collection of traits and memories and preferences that you refer to as yourself, and notice how this identity shifts and transforms across time in ways you rarely acknowledge. You are not the same person you were at age 7, nor are you identical to who you were merely 5 years ago, yet you maintain an unbroken narrative thread connecting all these versions of yourself into what feels like a continuous, stable entity. The memories that anchor your sense of identity are themselves notoriously unreliable, constantly being revised and rewritten each time you recall them, shaped by your current emotional state and present concerns, yet you treat them as objective records of who you truly are. Your personality traits, those aspects of yourself that feel most essential and unchanging, have been demonstrated through numerous psychological studies to be remarkably fluid and context-dependent, shifting dramatically depending on who you are with, what environment you find yourself in, and what role you believe you are expected to play. The values you hold dear, the convictions that define your moral character, the political beliefs that feel integral to your being, can transform radically over time through exposure to new information or changed circumstances. Yet each transformation feels like you are simply becoming more authentically yourself, rather than acknowledging a fundamental instability in your core identity. What persists, then, is not some unchanging essence, but rather a continuous process of narration, a story you tell yourself about continuity and coherence, where there is primarily only flux and discontinuity. Your brain constructs this identity narrative as a functional necessity, creating a unified sense of self that helps you navigate relationships and make decisions and maintain social bonds. Yet this functional narrative has become so thoroughly naturalized that you experience it as revelation rather than construction. Consider for a moment the extraordinary prevalence of pattern throughout the observable universe, from the spiraling arms of distant galaxies to the crystalline structures of snowflakes, from the rhythmic beating of your own heart to the mathematical sequences hidden within flower petals and seashells. We encounter pattern everywhere we look, and yet we rarely pause to ask the most fundamental question: why does pattern exist at all? In a universe governed by entropy and the tendency toward disorder, the existence of organized, repeating, predictable structures seems almost miraculous, yet we accept them as natural facts requiring no explanation. The human mind appears uniquely attuned to recognizing and extracting patterns from chaos, suggesting that our brains evolved specifically to identify these regularities as a survival mechanism, allowing us to predict future events based on past observations and prepare for threats or opportunities. This pattern recognition ability became so central to our cognition that we began imposing patterns onto randomness itself, creating meaning where none objectively exists, spinning narratives from noise, and finding significance in coincidence. The deeper question emerges when we consider whether patterns are discovered or invented, whether they exist independently in the fabric of reality or whether they are merely constructs of consciousness attempting to impose order on an indifferent universe. Mathematics suggests that patterns might be fundamental to reality itself, woven into the laws of physics and the structure of space and time, yet we cannot escape the possibility that we are simply beings whose minds are pattern-detecting machines, and therefore we find patterns because we are compelled to find them. The persistence of this question, even as science reveals more intricate patterns in quantum mechanics and cosmology, suggests that pattern may be both discovered and created simultaneously, that the universe generates regularities while consciousness selects which regularities to recognize and emphasize. Consider the simple act of measuring time in the present moment, that elusive now which we experience as the fabric of our conscious awareness, and you will encounter one of the most perplexing paradoxes that has troubled philosophers and physicists alike for centuries. For the present appears to be the only moment we can ever truly inhabit, yet it resists quantification with an almost stubborn persistence that defies our most intuitive assumptions about measurability. When we attempt to measure the present, we discover that by the time we have identified it, named it, or begun to record it in any meaningful way, it has already passed into the past, becoming memory rather than immediate experience. And what we are left measuring is not the present itself, but rather our recollection of it, our conceptual understanding of it, or the arbitrary units of time we have imposed upon it. The physicist confronts this problem through the lens of thermodynamics and relativity, recognizing that simultaneity itself is relative, that different observers in different reference frames cannot agree on what constitutes the present moment, and that any attempt to pinpoint the exact duration of now leads to increasingly smaller intervals that seem to approach zero without ever quite reaching it, suggesting that the present may have no measurable duration at all, but instead exists as an infinitesimal boundary between what has been and what will be. The human mind navigates this confusion by creating a psychological present, a specious present as it has been termed, which stretches roughly between 300 milliseconds and a few seconds, a window of awareness that contains what feels like the now, but is actually a composite of sensation, perception, and memory layered so seamlessly that we experience it as singular. Consider a vast forest that has existed for millions of years, untouched by any conscious observer, where trees grow and fall, where ecosystems flourish in intricate patterns of predator and prey, where colors shift with the seasons and sounds echo through valleys in rhythms that repeat endlessly without witness. Now imagine removing every human being from Earth entirely, erasing our species from existence, along with all other conscious creatures capable of interpretation and subjective experience. In that moment, would the patterns that once seemed so rich with meaning continue to exist as meaningful entities, or would they dissolve into mere physical processes, into atoms arranged in configurations that persist without purpose or significance? This question cuts to the very heart of our understanding of reality itself, forcing us to confront whether meaning is something we discover in the world or something we impose upon it through the act of consciousness itself. The mechanism at work here involves recognizing that meaning appears to be fundamentally tied to interpretation, to the capacity of a mind to take raw sensory information and transform it into something comprehensible and significant. A heartbeat has meaning only because a mind interprets it as a sign of life. A sunset has beauty only because consciousness experiences and values those wavelengths of light. A mathematical equation has truth only because a thinking entity can grasp its logical relationships. Yet we persist in behaving as though meaning exists independently, as though the forest would still be tragic or beautiful even without observers, as though moral truths hover in some realm waiting to be discovered rather than created. And this strange contradiction between what we intellectually suspect and how we fundamentally live reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness itself and its unavoidable role in constructing the reality we inhabit. Consider the weather system that seems impossibly random as it swirls across continents, the turbulent water that froths unpredictably around river rocks, or the crowd of people moving through a public space with what appears to be no coordinating principle whatsoever, each person pursuing their own trajectory and intention without regard for the others around them. These phenomena strike us as fundamentally chaotic, lacking structure or predictability, and yet beneath the surface of each exists a precise mathematical order governed by laws so intricate and interconnected that our minds struggle to perceive the underlying patterns. The weather follows fluid dynamics, the water obeys principles of physics rooted in molecular interaction, and the crowd moves according to principles of collective behavior and individual decision-making that, while complex, are not truly random. What we experience as chaos might simply be the result of such overwhelming complexity and such rapid iteration of cause and effect that our cognitive apparatus cannot track the web of causality fast enough to recognize the order beneath it. Our brains evolved to find patterns in immediate, observable phenomena, but they did not evolve to hold thousands of simultaneous variables in working memory or to project forward the consequences of countless interacting forces. When we encounter a system with too many variables, too many feedback loops, and too many interdependencies for us to consciously model, we default to labeling it chaotic rather than accepting that our own cognitive limitations prevent us from seeing the elegant order that may well be operating underneath. This discrepancy between objective reality and subjective perception has persisted throughout human history because our experience of the world is filtered through the narrow bandwidth of human attention and comprehension, and we have come to trust our immediate sensory experience and intuitive judgments even when confronted with evidence that these perceptions are incomplete or misleading. Consider the strange paradox that emerges when we attempt to contemplate our own non-existence, for in the very act of thinking about the state of not being, we find ourselves trapped within the consciousness that would cease to exist in that scenario. When you lie in bed at night and try to imagine what it will be like to not exist, to experience the void of your own death or the absence of your awareness, you are performing an impossible cognitive task, yet you perform it nonetheless with a peculiar sense of conviction and fear. The human mind instinctively recoils from this thought, not merely from the emotional weight of mortality, but from something more fundamental, the logical impossibility of the exercise itself. You cannot experience non-existence because experience itself requires an experiencer, a consciousness present to register and interpret whatever unfolds, and the moment there is experience, there is by definition the opposite of non-existence. This creates a curious situation where we spend considerable mental energy attempting to grasp something that, by its very nature, cannot be grasped, cannot be known, cannot be felt by the entity that is doing the grasping. The mechanism operating here involves our brain's inability to genuinely imagine the absence of itself. Instead, what we call imagining non-existence is actually imagining darkness, silence, or emptiness, which are still experiences, still states perceived through consciousness. We normalize this peculiar human preoccupation by embedding it throughout our culture, in philosophy, literature, and religion, treating the contemplation of non-existence as a legitimate and even noble pursuit, when in truth we are endlessly circling around something that may be fundamentally inaccessible to the human mind, and perhaps that inaccessibility itself is the most honest answer we could ever reach regarding what non-existence truly means. Consider the person who has lived the same life for decades, following the same routines, inhabiting the same patterns of thought, speaking the same words in the same situations, and yet who one day decides that everything will be different, that they will become someone new, and remarkably, they do change in ways that seem to defy the very inertia that held them static for so long. This phenomenon raises a curious question about the nature of reality itself. What is the mechanism that permits transformation when, logically speaking, the past should determine the present absolutely, and everything that is should simply continue being exactly as it has always been? The psychological mechanism appears to involve a sudden shift in awareness, a moment where the person recognizes their own agency within their circumstances, where they understand that the rules they have accepted as immutable are actually just habits that have been repeatedly chosen and reinforced. This recognition creates a peculiar gap in the causal chain, a space where the weight of previous conditions no longer feels binding, and in that gap emerges the freedom to choose differently. Yet this is deeply perplexing because nothing material has changed in the physical world, no external force has intervened, and the person possesses no more resources or abilities than they did moments before their decision. And yet somehow they proceed as though they had been given entirely new capacities. We have normalized this phenomenon so completely that we barely notice how strange it truly is, how it suggests that reality might contain within itself some property of openness, some fundamental malleability that contradicts our mechanistic understanding of cause and effect. We treat change as inevitable, as though time naturally propels us forward into new configurations, when in fact the universe could theoretically remain in perfect stasis, with every atom vibrating in precisely the same patterns forever, and yet somehow the possibility of difference is woven into the very fabric of what exists. Consider the moment you read a sentence on a screen before you, the letters arranged in patterns that carry meaning, and ask yourself where exactly that meaning exists in the physical world. The information seems to float somewhere between the electrons on your display and the neural patterns firing within your brain, yet it belongs fully to neither, and this peculiar status reveals something profound about the nature of reality itself. When you save a file to a hard drive, the information doesn't disappear into some immaterial realm. Instead, it manifests as magnetic orientations on a physical medium, arranging atoms in specific configurations that your computer can later read and reconstruct into meaningful patterns. Yet the actual information, the semantic content, the thing that makes those magnetic patterns worth preserving, seems to exist independent of any particular physical substrate, because the same information can be transferred from a hard drive to solid-state memory to paper to human memory without losing its essential character. This raises the fundamental question that has occupied philosophers and physicists for decades. Is information itself a physical entity, or is it something more abstract that merely uses physical systems as its temporary vessels? Some physicists argue that information must be fundamentally physical because it always requires some physical medium to exist, that there is no example in nature of information floating freely without embodiment in matter or energy. Others counter that information seems to transcend its physical instantiation in a way that pure matter does not, that the same data pattern could theoretically be encoded in infinite different ways across infinite different materials, suggesting that information is pattern rather than substance. We have normalized this ambiguity completely, building vast digital infrastructure on the assumption that information can be freely copied, moved, and transformed between systems, without ever truly resolving whether we are moving something physical or merely creating new physical instances of something abstract. Consider for a moment the fabric of space itself, the three dimensions we navigate every day: length, width, and height, and ask yourself whether these dimensions extend infinitely outward or whether they possess some ultimate boundary, some final edge where reality simply ceases to continue in that direction. In our lived experience, we perceive space as appearing to extend without apparent boundary, and when we look toward the horizon or upward into the night sky, our intuition suggests an endless expanse stretching forever into the distance. Yet this intuitive sense may be profoundly misleading about the actual structure of reality. Physics presents us with several competing frameworks. The classical Euclidean model suggests space extends infinitely in all directions without limit or curvature, while relativistic physics suggests that space itself is curved by the presence of matter and energy, potentially creating a topology where the universe might be finite yet boundless, like the surface of a sphere where you could theoretically travel forever without reaching an edge. String theory introduces additional complications by proposing that beyond our familiar three spatial dimensions, there may exist many more dimensions, perhaps 10 or 11 in total, that are curled up so tightly at quantum scales that we cannot directly perceive them, dimensions so compressed that they effectively have sharp limits even if the larger universe does not. The psychological mechanism underlying our difficulty with this question is that human consciousness evolved to navigate a relatively small scale of space, and our intuitions about boundaries and infinity were shaped by mammalian survival needs rather than by the actual geometric properties of reality itself. We struggle to imagine true infinity because our brains are built to process finite territories and finite resources, yet we equally struggle to imagine genuine boundaries because the horizon always seems to recede when we approach it. Consider the moment when you stand before something vast and timeless, perhaps gazing at an ancient mountain range or contemplating the infinite expanse of stars above, and in that instant you feel a peculiar sensation of your own consciousness stretching beyond its normal boundaries, as though you are momentarily touching something that exists outside the flow of moments that defines your ordinary existence. And yet the very nature of experience itself seems fundamentally incompatible with the concept of eternity, since experience requires duration, requires a before and an after, requires the passage of time through which events unfold and meaning emerges. The human mind, bound as it is to sequential consciousness, where one thought follows another in an endless chain of temporal progression, appears structurally unable to grasp what eternity actually means. For eternity is not an infinite amount of time, but rather the absence of time altogether, a state in which all moments exist simultaneously without progression or change, and our brains, evolved to navigate a world of cause and effect and sequential survival, cannot construct genuine mental imagery of such a state. Yet paradoxically, we often report experiencing moments that feel somehow outside of time, instants of profound beauty or terror or meditative clarity where the ticking of moments seems to pause, and we inhabit a kind of perpetual now that stretches indefinitely. Moments we describe using language borrowed from eternity itself, calling them timeless or eternal even as we experience them through the very mechanism that requires temporal flow. Consider the moment you wake from a vivid dream, that strange interval where your mind is still half suspended between two worlds, where the narrative you were just inhabiting feels as genuine and textured as waking life itself, complete with tactile sensations, emotional weight, and a coherent sense of place and purpose that only gradually dissolves as consciousness fully returns. During the dream state, your critical faculties are essentially offline. The parts of your brain responsible for logical evaluation and reality testing are significantly dampened. Yet the sensory cortex and emotional centers remain highly active, creating a paradox where you experience richness and immediacy without the usual filters that would normally question whether what you're perceiving makes sense. Your brain is generating these experiences in isolation, without external stimuli, yet it synthesizes them into what feels like a continuous, believable reality populated with people, environments, and causality that your sleeping mind accepts without skepticism. The mechanism appears to operate through the same neural pathways that process waking perception, which is why your brain cannot easily distinguish between internally generated imagery and external input once the prefrontal cortex has been quieted by sleep. What makes this persistence so remarkable is that even when dreams contain impossible physics or illogical sequences, your sleeping consciousness accepts them as normal, suggesting that your sense of reality is less about objective truth and more about the convincingness of the experience itself. The sheer neurological weight of sensory and emotional data your mind is presenting to itself. Consider the moment when you can no longer recall the face of someone you once loved, or when a memory that once defined you slips away into the fog of time, leaving only the faintest impression of what it meant. We experience forgetting as a gradual erosion, a slow fading of what was once vivid and alive in our minds, and in this sense, forgetting bears a striking resemblance to death itself. When a memory dies within us, something that existed in our consciousness ceases to exist in any meaningful way, at least in that particular form, in that particular intensity. The person you were when you held that memory, who experienced it fully and could recall it with crystalline clarity, dies too in a sense, replaced by a version of yourself who can only approximate what that experience meant. The psychological mechanism behind this equivalence runs deep into how consciousness works. We do not truly exist as continuous beings across time. Instead, we are sequences of moments held together by memory, by the narrative thread of recollection that connects our past selves to our present identity. When a memory vanishes completely, the experience might as well never have happened from the perspective of consciousness, because there is no longer any part of us that can access it or be changed by it. It returns to the void from which it came, as unreachable as death itself. Yet we have normalized forgetting as natural and necessary, a benign process separate entirely from anything as final as death. We tell ourselves that forgetting is healthy, that it allows us to move forward, to release ourselves from burden, and this is true in many ways. We have constructed an entire psychology around the idea that forgetting is not loss but liberation. And yet, when we face the prospect of our own forgetting, or watch someone we love fade away through dementia or Alzheimer's, the comforting narrative breaks down, and we glimpse the darker truth that forgetting is indeed a kind of dying, a death that occurs while the body still lives, a disappearance happening in real time. Consider the moment when you attempt to use logic to validate that logic is a reliable tool for understanding reality. You construct arguments, draw conclusions from premises, and apply the rules of reason to demonstrate that reason itself is trustworthy. Yet something peculiar emerges in this circular motion. You are using the very system you are trying to prove itself, which seems to assume the conclusion before establishing it. This recursive problem sits at the heart of epistemology, like a mirror reflecting another mirror infinitely backward. When you say that logical consistency is valuable because it leads to true conclusions, you are already relying on logical principles to make that claim. When you argue that contradictions cannot both be true at the same time, you appeal to the law of non-contradiction, which is itself a logical axiom rather than something derived from external observation. The mechanism underlying this puzzle is the fundamental bootstrapping problem of any foundational system. Every attempt to ground logic in something more fundamental than itself either reduces to circular reasoning or requires stepping outside logic entirely, which paradoxically uses logical thinking to do so. We navigate this contradiction daily without distress because we have normalized the acceptance of logic as a basic operating principle of human cognition and communication, much like we accept the ground beneath our feet without questioning its molecular composition before each step. Philosophy has long recognized that some frameworks cannot prove themselves from within their own boundaries and must instead be accepted as pragmatically useful or foundationally necessary. The persistence of this unresolved tension, despite centuries of rigorous examination, suggests that perhaps logic's validity rests not on self-proof, but on its remarkable effectiveness in generating predictions, solving problems, and creating consistency across diverse domains of human experience. Imagine standing on the surface of the Earth, feeling the constant downward pull that keeps your feet anchored to the ground, that draws rain from clouds, that holds the moon in orbit around our planet and our planet in orbit around the sun. We experience gravity as an undeniable force that shapes every moment of our physical existence. Yet when we ask whether this force possesses purpose, we encounter a peculiar collision between scientific description and existential meaning. Gravity operates according to mathematical laws that we have successfully described and predicted, following Einstein's geometric understanding of curved spacetime, where massive objects bend the fabric of reality itself. causing other objects to follow paths that appear to be attraction, but are actually the straightest lines through warped space. We can calculate with extraordinary precision where an object will fall, how fast a satellite will orbit, what trajectory a comet will follow through the cosmos, and these calculations work so reliably that we have built civilizations upon them. Yet for all our technical mastery, gravity remains purposeless in the sense that it serves no external goal or intention. It simply is a fundamental property of existence that operates according to mathematical relationships that appear to have no reason for existing in the precise form they take. The deeper puzzle emerges when we recognize that we have constructed our entire scientific worldview around the idea that natural forces require no purpose, that they merely follow patterns, and yet our minds seem biologically inclined to search for meaning and intention in everything we observe. We have normalized this absence of purpose so thoroughly that we rarely pause to contemplate the strangeness of living in a universe where the force that most intimately shapes our existence, that literally grounds us moment by moment, operates with complete indifference to our existence, our desires, or any conceivable goal beyond the mechanical unfolding of physical laws. Consider the profound observation that symmetry appears everywhere in our universe, from the bilateral structure of living organisms to the spherical form of planets and stars, from the geometric patterns of crystals to the mathematical equations that govern particle physics, and we have come to treat symmetry as though it were a fundamental feature of reality itself, rather than perhaps merely a pattern our minds recognize and favor. In the physical world, we find that the laws of nature exhibit remarkable symmetries: rotational symmetry, translational symmetry, and gauge symmetries. And physicists have built entire theoretical frameworks upon the premise that these symmetries are not accidental observations, but rather deep truths about how the universe is constructed, suggesting that conservation laws themselves emerge directly from symmetries through Noether's theorem. Yet when we examine this assumption more carefully, we must ask whether symmetry is truly woven into the fabric of reality at its most fundamental level, or whether symmetry is instead a projection of our own cognitive architecture onto a universe that may be fundamentally asymmetrical, indifferent, and far stranger than our pattern-seeking minds are equipped to perceive. The human brain has evolved to detect patterns and symmetries because such detection conferred survival advantages, recognizing the symmetrical face of a potential mate, identifying the symmetrical structure of a predator, organizing chaotic sensory information into meaningful wholes, and this evolutionary heritage may have biased us towards seeing symmetry where perhaps there is only coincidence, where perhaps the universe at its deepest level is utterly asymmetrical and broken. Consider the moment when you close your eyes and vividly picture a place you have visited, perhaps a childhood home or a beloved landscape, and in that moment the image feels almost as present, almost as tangible, as if you were standing there observing it with your eyes wide open. Yet when you open your eyes again, the physical reality reasserts itself with undeniable force, and you recognize that what you experienced in your mind, however vivid, however emotionally resonant, exists in a fundamentally different category of experience than the world that surrounds you in this present moment. The distinction seems clear and obvious at first consideration, because real things occupy space. They persist whether or not you are observing them, they can be verified by other people, they follow the laws of physics, while imagined things dissolve the moment your attention wavers. They exist only within the architecture of your consciousness, and yet when you examine this boundary more carefully, the line becomes strangely blurred because your brain processes imagined visual information using nearly the same neural pathways as it uses for genuine perception, which is why imagination can trigger real fear, real emotional responses, real physiological changes in your body that are no less genuine than responses to physical danger. The mechanism underlying this distinction rests on consistency and corroboration, on the fact that reality maintains a kind of democratic agreement with other consciousnesses, where we can all point to the same tree and call it real, whereas imagination requires no such consensus. Yet this mechanism breaks down at its edges when you consider dreams that feel entirely real while you are experiencing them, or when you contemplate how much of what you believe to be real is accepted not through direct experience, but through language and testimony, through the reports of others about a world you have never personally verified. Consider the profound discomfort that arises when we attempt to imagine the universe with boundaries, with edges where something ends and nothing begins, a finite cosmos contained within some unknowable perimeter that our minds struggle desperately to visualize or accept. Throughout human history, we have been conditioned to think of the universe as infinite, as an endless expanse stretching outward forever in all directions, a concept that feels intuitively correct despite being equally impossible for the human mind to fully comprehend. Yet modern cosmology presents us with a serious alternative possibility, that the universe might indeed be finite, perhaps even geometrically bounded like the surface of a sphere, expanding outward but ultimately folding back upon itself in ways we cannot directly observe or perceive from our limited vantage point within it. The mechanism underlying our resistance to this idea operates through a fundamental perceptual limitation built into how human consciousness evolved and how it processes spatial information. Our brains developed to navigate finite Earth environments, to understand boundaries and edges, to grasp the concept of a container with limits. Yet when we scale these same reasoning tools up to the cosmic level, they produce a kind of vertigo, a sense of suffocation at the thought of walls at the edge of existence itself. We have normalized the concept of infinity specifically because finiteness feels psychologically threatening, because it implies confinement and limitation at the grandest possible scale, touching something primal in human consciousness that fears being trapped or enclosed. Even as physicists present sophisticated mathematical models describing a finite universe with positive curvature and no edge, even as observations from deep space telescopes could theoretically support such a conclusion, we resist with an almost visceral rejection, preferring the comfortable abstraction of endlessness to the disturbing certainty of boundaries. Demonstrating how our emotional need for unboundedness persists entirely independent of what the actual structure of reality might truly be. Consider the simple act of drinking your morning coffee from the same mug on consecutive days, or the way you walk the same route to work, or how you repeat the same greeting to colleagues week after week. We speak of these moments as repetition, as though the second occurrence is somehow identical to the first, yet if we examine this notion with genuine scrutiny, we encounter a profound logical impossibility that haunts the nature of recurrence itself. The coffee tastes subtly different because your taste buds have changed, your body temperature differs, the ambient light falling through the window is at a slightly different angle, and crucially, you are not the same person who drank from that mug yesterday, for you have accumulated new memories, new cells have replaced old ones, and your consciousness carries the weight of another day's experience. The route to work appears familiar, yet the trees have grown imperceptibly, the cracks in the sidewalk have shifted, other pedestrians occupy different positions, and the you that walks it possesses different thoughts and concerns than the you that walked it before. What we call repetition is therefore not identity, but rather a collection of distinct moments that our minds have learned to group together under a single categorical umbrella for the sake of cognitive efficiency and practical navigation through existence. Our brains perform an extraordinary act of conceptual compression, filtering out the countless differences and variations between moments and treating them as though they were the same, because true awareness of absolute uniqueness and non-identity in every instant would render daily functioning nearly impossible. Yet this coping mechanism, this useful fiction we have constructed, persists so thoroughly in our thinking that we rarely question whether what we call the same thing truly is the same at all, or whether we are simply engaging in a comfortable collective hallucination that allows us to believe in patterns, routines, and predictability where perhaps none genuinely exist. Consider the simple act of measuring the distance between two objects in your room, where you stretch a measuring tape from one wall to another and observe the numerical value that emerges, a quantifiable representation of separation that feels entirely concrete and undeniable in its existence. Yet when you pause to examine what distance truly is, you encounter a curious paradox. Distance appears to be nothing more than the difference in position between 2 points, a purely mathematical abstraction that describes relationship rather than substance, and in this sense it seems to require no actual space at all, only the conceptual framework through which we perceive position. In the physical world, we habitually assume that distance must exist within space, that it is somehow dependent upon or contained within the three-dimensional spatial continuum we navigate daily. But this assumption becomes questionable when we consider that distance itself might be the very means by which we define what space is in the first place, creating a circular dependency where one concept seems to lean upon the other for its validity. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deeply ingrained spatial reasoning, developed through millions of years of evolution, which has conditioned us to experience distance as something that stretches between objects within an encompassing container called space. And we find it nearly impossible to imagine distance existing independent of this spatial framework, because our sensory apparatus and cognitive structures are fundamentally calibrated to perceive the world through spatial dimensions. Yet mathematicians and physicists have discovered that distance can be defined in abstract spaces that bear no resemblance to physical three-dimensional reality, in spaces with infinite dimensions or fractional dimensions, or in purely numerical spaces where distance represents difference in value rather than physical separation, suggesting that distance is a more fundamental concept than space itself, one that can exist in contexts where space has no meaningful application. Consider the peculiar situation of a photon traveling from the sun to your eye, a journey that takes approximately 8 minutes and 20 seconds from our perspective on Earth, yet according to the laws of physics, this photon experiences no passage of time whatsoever. The moment it is created in the nuclear furnace of the sun is, from the photon's point of view, identical to the moment it strikes your retina, compressed into a single eternal instant with no duration between them. This is not metaphorical or poetic, but rather a direct consequence of Einstein's theory of relativity, which demonstrates that time dilation increases with velocity until reaching the speed of light, where time effectively ceases to flow. The photon, traveling at the maximum possible speed through the universe, exists in a state of temporal stasis, where yesterday and tomorrow collapse into an infinitesimal present moment that never changes or progresses. The psychological mechanism that makes this difficult to grasp is our profound dependence on experiencing time as a fundamental dimension of reality, something that flows steadily forward, carrying us inexorably from birth toward death, allowing memory and anticipation to structure our consciousness. We assume that all existence must participate in this river of time, that any object moving through space must also be moving through time, yet light reveals a strange asymmetry in the universe, where the fastest thing imaginable experiences the slowest possible time, or perhaps no time at all. We have largely normalized this paradox by confining it to the abstract realm of theoretical physics, treating it as a mathematical curiosity rather than confronting the genuinely disorienting implications of a universe where experience itself might be dependent on speed, where consciousness might require slowness, and where the most fundamental particle of light that brings us vision and energy exists in a condition so alien to our own temporal experience that we can barely hold the concept in our minds before it slips away into abstraction. Consider the profound question of whether evolution, the process by which all life on Earth has developed and diversified over billions of years, moves toward some predetermined endpoint or follows a fundamentally random and undirected path shaped only by the pressures of natural selection and environmental circumstance. When we observe the remarkable complexity of living organisms, the intricate design of eyes and brains and immune systems, we feel an almost irresistible pull toward the conclusion that such sophistication must be aimed at something, must be progressing toward greater perfection or consciousness or moral sophistication, as though the entire history of life were a narrative with direction and purpose and destination. This intuition is so compelling that it has shaped human thought for centuries, embedding itself in religious frameworks and philosophical systems, and even in how we interpret the scientific evidence itself, sometimes unconsciously tilting our language toward terms like progress and advancement and improvement when describing evolutionary changes. Yet the mechanical reality appears to be far more austere. Evolution has no foresight, no goal, no architect, only the blind operation of variation and selection across millions of generations, where organisms that happen to be better suited to their environment leave more descendants, and this utterly simple principle, repeated endlessly, produces the dazzling diversity we observe without requiring any direction whatsoever. The psychological mechanism that sustains our belief in directed evolution, despite the logical sufficiency of random processes, is our profound discomfort with purposelessness, and our evolved tendency to perceive patterns and intent even where none exist. A pattern recognition system that served our ancestors well, but now leads us to project meaning onto processes that contain none. Consider the peculiar situation in which modern consciousness finds itself when contemplating the origins of the universe. We have constructed an elaborate and beautiful framework called physics to describe how reality operates, yet this framework itself requires conditions, laws, and structures that must have existed prior to its own emergence, and this creates a logical recursion that our minds struggle to resolve with any genuine satisfaction. Physics, as we understand it, describes the behavior of matter, energy, space, and time through mathematical principles and natural laws. Yet these laws themselves are not explained by physics, but rather assumed as fundamental givens that physics simply observes and documents, raising the unsettling question of what established these laws in the first place and what medium or substrate existed before the very framework we use to understand existence came into being. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a form of conceptual vertigo, wherein our minds reach toward an explanatory foundation only to discover that the foundation itself requires explanation, creating an infinite regress that we attempt to resolve through mathematical abstraction, through appeals to necessity, or through the peculiar notion that perhaps the laws of physics simply always existed without cause or origin. We have normalized this intellectual impasse by accepting what physicists call the boundary conditions of the universe, by treating the existence of physical law as something that need not be explained further, and by focusing our inquiries on how those laws produce the phenomena we observe rather than on why those laws exist at all. Yet this normalized approach masks a profound gap in our understanding that sits at the very heart of cosmological reasoning. What existed before the emergence of physical law remains genuinely inaccessible to physical inquiry by definition, since physics cannot be used to explain what precedes physics, and this methodological limitation may not be merely temporary, but instead fundamental and permanent to the structure of human knowledge. Consider a universe stripped bare of consciousness, devoid of any thinking entity to contemplate existence or wonder about its nature. In such a hypothetical void, imagine a physical scenario unfolding as it always would according to the laws of physics. Gravitational waves ripple through spacetime, chemical reactions occur within distant nebulae, particles interact and transform in their predetermined patterns. Now ask yourself whether the question of why these things happen continues to exist in some meaningful sense, or whether it dissolves entirely into irrelevance without a mind present to pose it. This is the philosophical puzzle that sits at the intersection of metaphysics and epistemology, challenging us to examine what we truly mean by the existence of a question itself. The mechanism underlying this riddle operates on a fundamental distinction between two separate categories, the physical world and our conscious representation of it. A question, we commonly understand, is a linguistic and conceptual construct that arises within the cognitive architecture of a thinking being seeking clarification or deeper understanding about something. It requires language, intentionality, a mind directed towards some unknown that demands resolution. Yet the curious paradox emerges when we recognize that the conditions giving rise to questions might exist independently of any mind to articulate them, as patterns or structures within reality that possess an inherent quality of mystery or uncertainty. We have normalized this ambiguity by rarely pausing to examine whether questions are inventions of consciousness, or whether they represent something discovered within the fabric of reality itself. This persistence of uncertainty without clear resolution reflects how deeply embedded our assumptions about mind and reality have become in our everyday thinking, leaving us suspended between the intuition that questions are products of cognition and the alternative suggestion that they might represent objective features of an intelligible universe awaiting recognition. Consider the fundamental nature of time itself as we observe it in the physical world, where broken things remain broken and scattered things do not spontaneously reassemble into their original forms. When you drop a ceramic mug and it shatters across the kitchen floor, we accept without question that those fragments will never by themselves rejoin into a whole mug again, and this understanding forms the basis of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy, or disorder, always increases in a closed system and never reverses. Yet as we contemplate this law in the quiet darkness before sleep, we must confront a peculiar paradox that physicists have grappled with for more than a century, which is that the fundamental laws of physics at the microscopic level, whether classical mechanics or quantum mechanics, are actually time-reversible, meaning that if you were to reverse the velocity of every particle in the universe at any given moment, the universe would theoretically run backward perfectly as it had run forward. This creates a logical contradiction because if the underlying rules governing individual particles are reversible, How can the collective behavior of trillions upon trillions of those particles be irreversible? The answer lies not in the laws themselves, but in probability and initial conditions. For while it is theoretically possible that all the scattered atoms of a broken mug could randomly reassemble into a whole mug, the probability of this occurring is so monumentally small, so unimaginably unlikely, that it would require more time than the age of the universe itself, repeated countless times over. We have normalized this irreversibility not because the laws require it, but because our universe began in a state of extraordinarily low entropy, and the second law describes not an absolute prohibition, but rather the overwhelming statistical likelihood that systems will progress toward disorder, making entropy irreversible not in principle but in practice and in the scale of human perception and human timescales. Consider the simple act of folding a piece of paper repeatedly, watching how the creases become darker and more permanent with each fold, or think about how a rubber band stretched too many times loses its elasticity and never quite returns to its original form, or observe how a wooden chair, sat upon for decades, develops grooves that mirror the shape of those who have occupied it. These phenomena suggest that matter itself retains some imprint of its history, some encoded record of the forces and pressures applied to it over time. A metal wire bent back and forth will eventually snap at the same location where it has been flexed most frequently, as though the material remembers the violence of previous deformations and weakens in preparation for failure. The physics of this process involves something called work hardening or strain hardening, where the atomic structure of a material becomes altered by mechanical stress, creating a kind of structural memory written into the very lattice of existence. Yet we must ask whether this is truly memory in any meaningful sense, or whether it is simply the inevitable consequence of physical laws, the mathematical outcome of atoms rearranging themselves according to the rules of thermodynamics and crystallography. Materials scientists call these changes permanent deformation, irreversible transformations that occur when stress exceeds the elastic limit, yet the language itself betrays an assumption that something is being preserved, stored, remembered within the substance. Even more mysteriously, certain materials exhibit what researchers call shape memory alloys, metals that can return to their original form after deformation when heated to a specific temperature, as though they possess an actual memory of what they once were and actively strive to become that again. Consider a simple observation from everyday experience. When you watch a leaf drift across a still pond, you perceive motion as something independent, as though the leaf's movement is a quality that exists in isolation from everything else around it. Yet if you pause to examine this perception more carefully, you begin to notice something peculiar and unsettling about the very nature of motion itself. Motion in its most fundamental sense requires a reference point against which change can be measured and observed. The leaf does not move in absolute terms through some invisible void. It moves relative to the water's surface, relative to the banks of the pond, relative to your own stationary position as the observer. Without these points of reference, without something stable or different to measure against, the concept of motion becomes impossible to define or even to conceptualize. Think about the implications of this realization. If every single object in the universe were moving at precisely the same velocity in the same direction, with nothing stationary and nothing changing relative to anything else, would motion still exist? Or would the universe experience a kind of absolute stillness despite constant kinetic energy? The human mind tends to treat motion as though it is an inherent property of objects themselves, a quality that belongs solely to the thing in motion, yet physics and philosophy both suggest that motion is fundamentally relational, a description of how one thing changes position relative to something else. We have normalized this concept so thoroughly that we rarely question whether motion can truly stand alone as an independent phenomenon. We speak of objects moving through space as if motion were a tangible substance, a force contained within the moving thing itself, when in reality it appears to be nothing more than a mathematical relationship, a comparison, a measurement that only becomes meaningful in the presence of contrast. Consider the simple act of touching a warm cup of coffee on a winter morning, that sensation of heat spreading through your fingers and palm, the comfort it brings to your body as you stand shivering in the cold. We speak of temperature as though it exists independently in the world, a measurable property of objects themselves, something we can trust our thermometers to reveal with mathematical precision. Yet when we examine this concept more carefully, we begin to notice something peculiar about our relationship with heat and cold. Temperature, in its most fundamental form, is not a thing but a description of molecular motion, the average kinetic energy of particles vibrating within matter, and this motion only becomes what we call temperature through our interaction with it, through our sensory apparatus and our instruments designed to quantify what our bodies cannot directly measure. The warmth you feel is not the temperature itself, but rather a neural signal generated by your skin cells responding to the transfer of energy, a private experience occurring within your consciousness that bears only a correspondence to the underlying physical reality. No object possesses temperature in isolation. Temperature emerges only in relation to something else, a comparison, a measurement against a standard we have collectively agreed upon. A cup of water at 50 degrees Celsius might feel burning hot to your hand or refreshingly cool to your body, depending on the context and your baseline, and the water itself remains indifferent to your sensation, continuing its molecular dance regardless of your perception. We have constructed thermometers and temperature scales to objectify this experience, to transform a subjective sensation into a number that appears independent of the observer. Yet even these instruments require calibration, interpretation, and agreement about what the markings mean. Consider the question that has haunted philosophers, theologians, and scientists for millennia. What truly distinguishes humans from all other creatures on Earth, and is that distinction as absolute as we have come to believe? We find ourselves in a peculiar position where we have constructed elaborate civilizations, developed complex languages, and created technologies that seem to transcend the natural world. Yet when we examine each of these accomplishments in isolation, we discover that nearly every capacity we celebrate has some precedent in the animal kingdom, whether in dolphins communicating across vast distances, crows solving multi-step problems, or elephants mourning their dead with what appears to be genuine emotional depth. We have long claimed consciousness as uniquely ours, yet we cannot definitively prove that our experience of awareness differs fundamentally from that of a crow or an octopus, and the more we study animal behavior, the more we recognize sophisticated emotional landscapes in species we previously dismissed as merely instinctual. The psychological mechanism underlying our persistent belief in human uniqueness appears rooted in our species' need for existential significance and hierarchical placement within the natural order, a requirement that seems to emerge from our awareness of mortality and our desire to justify our dominance over other life forms. We have normalized this exceptionalism so thoroughly that it permeates our legal systems, our ethical frameworks, and even our casual conversations, where we speak of ourselves as separate from nature rather than part of it. And we have done so with such conviction that most humans experience genuine surprise when confronted with evidence that animals possess empathy, use tools, engage in play, plan for the future, or demonstrate something resembling moral behavior. Consider the empty room you pass through each day, the silence that fills your ear when all sound ceases, the darkness that surrounds you when every light extinguishes, and ask yourself whether these absences possess any tangible form or boundary at all. When we speak of nothingness, we instinctively describe it in relation to something, reaching for metaphors of voids and gaps and hollows, yet these words themselves suggest a kind of vessel, a container with edges and dimensions that the nothing somehow occupies. The void around us seems to have no inherent shape, and yet the moment we attempt to comprehend it, we involuntarily impose structure upon it, defining it against the presence of matter and meaning. A room becomes rectangular because walls and floors and ceilings give it geometry, but the emptiness within that room has no shape of its own until we measure the space between objects. Silence has no acoustic properties until we recognize it as the absence of sound waves, yet we speak of it as though it were something substantial enough to possess character. The psychological mechanism at work here reveals that our minds cannot genuinely apprehend pure nothingness. We can only understand absence through presence, only conceive of emptiness in relation to fullness. Our consciousness requires contrast and boundary to function, and so we cannot look upon true void without our perception immediately filling it with implied form and structure, without our language and imagination giving it temporary shape. Perhaps this is why mathematicians invented zero as a number rather than leaving it as mere absence. They needed to give nothingness a shape, a symbol, a place in the ordered structure of understanding. In doing so, they transformed the void from something incomprehensible into something that could be counted, compared, and manipulated, proving that shape itself may be less a property of things and more a projection of the human mind desperately seeking to hold nothing in its grasp. Consider a moment when you walked into a room filled with people engaged in conversation, and you immediately felt unwelcome, sensing tension and judgment directed toward you, only to learn later that everyone had been absorbed in their own discussions and had barely noticed your arrival at all. This experience reveals something profound about the architecture of human consciousness. What you perceived as reality in that moment was constructed entirely from internal interpretations, emotional states, and cognitive patterns rather than from objective facts existing independently in the world around you. Your brain, operating with incomplete information and filtered through years of accumulated experiences, memories, and insecurities, had essentially created a version of reality that felt utterly convincing while being substantially different from what was actually occurring. This phenomenon extends far beyond moments of social anxiety, reaching into every aspect of how we navigate existence, from the way we interpret a partner's silence as coldness or preoccupation to how we experience physical pain, which is not merely a transmission of signals from our body, but a complex construction involving expectation, memory, attention, and emotional context. The mechanism underlying this perceptual reality gap operates through several interconnected systems within the brain that prioritize survival and pattern recognition over objective accuracy. Your sensory organs receive only a fraction of available information, filtered through the limitations of human biology, and your brain then actively constructs an experience from this incomplete data, filling in gaps with predictions based on previous patterns and current emotional states. This process, known as predictive processing, means that perception is fundamentally generative rather than receptive, constantly building a model of reality rather than passively observing it. When you expect something to happen, your brain literally prepares to perceive it, making you more likely to notice confirming evidence while filtering out contradictory information. Consider the moment when you flip a coin, watching it spin through the air with genuine uncertainty about whether it will land on heads or tails, feeling the authentic suspense that accompanies not knowing the outcome until the very instant it settles onto the table before you. In that moment, you experience what feels unmistakably like pure chance, like randomness asserting itself into the deterministic fabric of reality. Yet beneath this experience lies a profound philosophical tension that becomes apparent when we examine the mechanisms underlying what we call probability and uncertainty. The coin's trajectory is governed entirely by the laws of physics, the force applied to it, the air resistance it encounters, the spin rate imparted by your thumb, the exact angle of its initial release, the gravitational field pulling it downward, the surface it lands upon. Given perfect knowledge of all these variables and perfect computational power, the outcome would be completely predictable, completely determined by the preceding conditions, and yet we experience it as random because our minds cannot possibly track all these variables simultaneously. This reveals that what we call chance might actually be a function of our ignorance rather than genuine indeterminacy in the universe, a limitation of our knowledge rather than a property of reality itself. We have built entire systems of probability and statistics based on this felt experience of randomness. We have normalized uncertainty as an irreducible feature of existence, and we make decisions every day assuming that true chance governs everything from the weather to genetic mutations to the outcomes of future events. Consider the peculiar impulse we have to quantify everything that exists, to assign numerical values to phenomena that may fundamentally resist such categorization. And yet we persist in this endeavor as though existence itself could be reduced to measurable units and standardized metrics. We measure time in seconds and minutes, space in meters and miles, mass in kilograms, yet when we attempt to measure the existence of consciousness itself, or the authenticity of an experience, or the depth of a relationship, we find ourselves reaching for units that seem inadequate to the task at hand. A human life is often measured in years lived, but a single moment of profound beauty might contain more existential weight than decades of routine monotony, and yet our measurement systems cannot account for this qualitative disparity between quantity and meaning. We have created elaborate systems of measurement that work remarkably well for physical matter and observable phenomena, giving us the illusion that we can catalog and contain all of reality within our numerical frameworks. Yet the very act of existing cannot itself be quantified without losing something essential in the translation. The scientist can measure the chemical composition of love in terms of oxytocin and dopamine levels, but the measurement fails to capture the phenomenon itself, and we are left with numbers that describe the mechanism but not the meaning, the machinery but not the mystery. We have normalized this reduction of existence into measurable categories so completely that we rarely question whether the act of measuring might fundamentally alter or diminish what we are trying to understand, whether the very attempt to quantify existence might be inherently incompatible with the nature of being itself. The comfort of measurement lies in its promise of control and comprehension, yet existence seems designed by its very nature to slip through the nets we cast for it, to remain somewhat beyond the reach of our most sophisticated instruments and calculations. Consider the physicist who spends decades searching for a unified theory, believing that beneath all the complexity of the universe lies something elegantly simple, some fundamental principle from which all else derives, and yet when she finally glimpses what might be that principle, she discovers it generates infinite complexity through recursive applications and symmetry breaking, suggesting that perhaps the simple thing is not the end of the search but merely the starting point. And that complexity itself might be equally fundamental to reality as whatever simplicity supposedly underlies it. We have inherited an assumption from centuries of scientific tradition that simpler explanations are better, that nature prefers economy, that elegance is a mark of truth, and this assumption has served us remarkably well in building technologies and understanding forces, yet it remains fundamentally an assumption rather than a discovered law of the universe itself. The human mind evolved to recognize patterns and to compress information into memorable categories because doing so increased survival, and therefore our brains are naturally biased toward seeking simplicity, toward finding the one rule that explains many cases, toward preferring the explanation that requires fewer moving parts even when a more complex explanation might be more accurate or complete. We see this bias everywhere, in how we reduce complex human motivations to simple personality types, how we compress rich historical events into simplified narratives, how we treat complicated social phenomena as if they stem from single causes, and this cognitive shortcut has become so deeply wired into our scientific methodology and our philosophical frameworks that we rarely question whether the universe itself actually cares about our preference for simplicity. Consider the boundary between two things, that invisible line we imagine separates a forest from a field, or where your body ends and the air begins, and you might notice that the edge itself has no substance, no measurable width, no actual location in space that you could point to and say this is where the transition occurs. When you stand at the shoreline watching waves crash against sand, the edge between ocean and land shifts with every tide, every grain displaced, yet we continue to speak of it as though it were a real and fixed thing with definitive properties. Even at the microscopic level, where we might expect clarity, the boundary between one material and another dissolves into gradients of density and molecular transition, with no precise moment where one substance truly ends and another begins. And yet we organize our entire understanding of reality around these edges that seem to exist primarily in our minds rather than in the physical world itself. The psychological mechanism underlying this tendency appears to be our brain's need to categorize and compartmentalize information so that reality becomes manageable and predictable, transforming the continuous spectrum of existence into discrete units separated by clear dividing lines that allow us to navigate, communicate, and make sense of overwhelming sensory data. We have become so accustomed to thinking in terms of edges and boundaries that we rarely question whether they possess any objective reality, or whether they are instead a kind of cognitive tool we have projected onto a world that might be fundamentally continuous and indivisible. Even our sense of identity relies on an edge, a border around what we call the self that separates us from everything else. Yet this edge too proves elusive under scrutiny. As our body is constantly exchanging atoms with the environment, our thoughts are shaped by culture and biology we do not control, and our consciousness remains mysteriously undefined at its margins. Consider the human body as a system unto itself, a network of billions of cells communicating through chemical and electrical signals, each cell following rules written in DNA, each organ operating according to principles of physics and biology that were discovered only through external observation and scientific study. Yet this system, the body, somehow contains within itself a consciousness that believes it understands how it works, though in truth most of what happens inside remains fundamentally mysterious even to the mind that inhabits it. You cannot feel your liver processing toxins, cannot observe your immune system identifying pathogens, cannot directly perceive the mechanisms by which your neurons fire and create the sensation of this very moment of awareness. The system operates largely in darkness to itself, following protocols it did not write and cannot fully comprehend, yet it persists in the conviction that understanding is possible, that knowledge can be accumulated and integrated into some coherent picture of self. This same paradox scales upward to societies and economies, vast systems of human interaction and exchange that follow patterns no single person understands completely, systems that operate according to invisible rules that emerge from millions of individual choices, yet we study them as though they are comprehensible machines that simply need the right expert to decode them. The more complex a system becomes, the more its own components struggle to perceive its full operation, and yet the more urgently those components believe that understanding must be attainable. Perhaps there exists a fundamental limit to self-understanding, a boundary beyond which a system cannot observe itself without ceasing to function, or ceasing to be itself, much as eye cannot see itself without a mirror, and that mirror is merely another system equally blind to its own nature. This paradox offers an unexpected comfort as you drift toward sleep. The acceptance that some mysteries are not flaws to be corrected, but structural necessities woven into the fabric of existence itself. Consider the experience of entering a completely dark room, where no light penetrates from any source, and notice how your immediate instinct is to describe this space as filled with darkness, as though darkness were a tangible substance occupying the volume around you like water fills a cup or air fills a balloon. You might say the room is dark, that darkness surrounds you, that you are enveloped in darkness. Yet if we examine this language and the reality it attempts to describe, we encounter a curious paradox at the heart of perception itself. Darkness is not actually a presence of anything at all, but rather the complete absence of photons, the absence of electromagnetic radiation within the visible spectrum, the absence of light itself. And yet we have constructed an entire vocabulary and framework of understanding that treats it as though it were a positive force, a real thing with substance and agency, when in fact it possesses no such properties whatsoever. When you turn off a light in a room, nothing is added to that space. Rather, something is removed, subtracted, taken away, and the darkness you experience is simply the name we have given to the void left behind by that absence. Your brain, however, does not naturally process absence as easily as it processes presence, for your neural pathways evolved to detect things that are there, to identify objects and threats and sources of nourishment, and so your mind automatically interprets the absence of light as a kind of presence, a darkness that exists as a counterpart to light, a yin to light's yang. This cognitive mechanism makes evolutionary sense, for in the absence of visual information, your brain must activate other systems of awareness and caution, heightening your other senses, triggering an alertness that would have served your ancestors well in actual darkness. And so the neural response to the absence of light becomes so automatic, so deeply embedded in your consciousness, that you experience darkness as real, as palpable, as present. Even though logically you understand it to be nothing more than the negation of photons. Consider for a moment the simple act of standing on a scale, watching the needle rise or the digital display illuminate with a number that represents your weight, a measurement so fundamental to how we understand our bodies that we rarely question its deepest nature. We place an object on a surface and expect it to press downward with a certain force, and we call this weight, yet this seemingly straightforward phenomenon depends entirely on the presence of gravity, a force we experience as an invisible pull toward the earth that gives mass its measurable heaviness. The question that emerges from this observation is whether weight is an intrinsic property of matter itself, something that exists independent of gravitational fields, or whether it is entirely constructed through the relationship between mass and gravitational attraction. In reality, weight is not a property of an object in isolation, but rather a relational phenomenon that requires both mass and a gravitational field to exist at all, and this distinction becomes strikingly apparent when we imagine an astronaut floating in the vacuum of space, possessing the same mass as they had on Earth, yet experiencing weightlessness, experiencing zero weight despite their matter remaining unchanged. The psychological mechanism that causes us to conflate weight with mass, to treat weight as though it were a fundamental characteristic of objects rather than a situational experience, stems from our entire evolutionary history spent on the surface of a planet where gravity is constant and omnipresent, where every sensation of heaviness reinforces the belief that objects naturally possess this property. We have built entire systems of commerce, medicine, and self-perception around the measurement of weight, and these systems persist even though they measure something that is entirely dependent on circumstance rather than essence. Yet we continue to speak of weight as though it were an objective truth about objects rather than a description of how objects interact with gravitational fields. Consider the fundamental axiom that has governed physics for centuries, the law of conservation of energy, which states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but only transformed from one form into another. We observe this principle operating everywhere in the natural world, from the burning of fuel that converts chemical energy into heat and light, to the movement of objects that converts potential energy into kinetic energy, to the electrical currents flowing through wires that transform stored power into motion and illumination. Yet despite this seemingly absolute law that has been tested and verified countless times across innumerable experiments and observations, we continue to speak casually about energy being wasted, lost, or destroyed in our daily lives, as though these processes represent a genuine cessation of energy rather than a mere transformation into forms we cannot harness or perceive directly. When we flip a light switch and electricity powers a bulb, we understand intellectually that the energy is converting into light and heat, but our language and intuition treat it as if it simply vanishes into the void once the light turns off. The psychological mechanism underlying this contradiction stems from our limited perception of energy transformation. We identify energy with usefulness and accessibility, so when it becomes dispersed as ambient heat in the environment or scattered in forms we cannot capture, our minds categorize it as lost or destroyed rather than merely redistributed. This fundamental disconnect between what we know scientifically to be true and how we actually experience and describe energy persists with remarkable tenacity, normalized so thoroughly in our speech and thought patterns that we rarely pause to recognize the contradiction embedded within it, suggesting perhaps that our intuitive relationship with energy operates on an entirely different framework than the one physics has so carefully constructed and verified. Consider the simple act of drawing a perfect circle on paper, and ask yourself whether that circle exists in any meaningful sense beyond the physical marks you have made. When we study geometry, we encounter triangles, squares, and spheres that possess properties we can measure and calculate with absolute precision. Yet when we search the natural world for these perfect forms, we find that no genuine circle exists anywhere in nature. For every curve contains irregularities invisible to our perception, and every angle in the physical universe is merely an approximation of the abstract ideal we carry in our minds. Geometry appears to describe something fundamental about reality, as if the universe itself is fundamentally mathematical in structure, yet we must confront the troubling possibility that we have simply invented a language so elegant and useful that we have confused our own creation with the underlying truth of existence. We use geometry to build bridges and launch rockets, and these structures stand and fly, which seems to suggest that geometry must be real, that it must be describing something true about the world. And yet this success might merely indicate that our invented system happens to correlate well enough with physical reality to be predictive, without necessarily revealing any deeper reality beneath. The mathematician discovers geometric truths through pure reason and logical deduction, never needing to observe the physical world, which suggests that geometry is an eternal structure existing independent of physical matter, perhaps living in some abstract realm of pure forms as Plato once theorized. Yet the physicist measures the world and finds that at the quantum level, space itself becomes uncertain and probabilistic, that the clean geometric structures we rely upon seem to dissolve into something far stranger and more fundamental, something that geometry merely approximates at larger scales. Consider the peculiar fact that you experience this exact moment, this precise instant of consciousness, as fundamentally different from all other moments that have ever existed or ever will exist. Right now, as you listen to these words, the present moment feels vivid, real, and uniquely privileged in a way that yesterday or tomorrow simply do not. The past has become memory, a recording that exists only in your mind, while the future remains abstract and unconceived, a realm of possibility rather than actuality. Yet the present moment, this now, possesses an almost tangible quality of being truly alive in a way nothing else seems to be. When you ask yourself what makes this moment special, you are confronting one of the deepest puzzles of existence, because when you examine it logically, the distinction begins to dissolve. From a physical standpoint, if we accept that time is a dimension much like the dimensions of space, then your present moment is not actually moving through time at all. Rather, all moments exist simultaneously in what physicists call the block universe, where past, present, and future are equally real, equally existent, spread out across the timeline like frames in a film. In this view, there is nothing inherently more real about now than about any other moment in history. Yet psychologically, we remain trapped in what seems like an ever-moving present, always experiencing the eternal now as though it is the only moment that truly exists. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we rarely notice it. We speak of time passing, of moments flowing toward us like a river, of the present moment as something precious and fleeting, yet we cannot explain why this moment deserves its special status when physics suggests all moments are equally real. This remains one of the most intimate paradoxes of human consciousness, the gap between what we feel to be true about now and what reason seems to suggest. Consider the fundamental nature of a wave as we have always understood it, moving through water with visible crests and troughs, or vibrating through air, a sound that we hear with our ears, or trembling through the earth during seismic events that shake our foundations. Throughout history, physicists and philosophers alike held it as an unquestionable truth that waves required a medium through which to travel, some substance or material that would oscillate and transfer energy from one point to another in this undulating pattern. This seemed logically inevitable because every wave we could directly observe in the natural world appeared to demand this requirement. And yet when light from distant stars reached our eyes traveling across the vast emptiness of space, or when electromagnetic radiation moved through what we called the vacuum, this assumption began to crack and fragment beneath scrutiny. The psychological comfort we derived from the medium theory rested on the simple reasoning that waves were disturbances in something, vibrations of matter itself, and without that matter present, without air or water or solid ground to oscillate, how could a disturbance exist at all? We built our intuitions around observable phenomena and extrapolated outward with confidence, creating a mental framework that felt complete and satisfying in its logical coherence. Yet modern physics revealed that electromagnetic waves, including visible light itself, could propagate through empty space without requiring any classical medium, and this discovery forced us to reimagine what a wave actually is at its most fundamental level, suggesting that perhaps waves are not merely disturbances in material substrates, but rather fluctuations in underlying fields that permeate all of reality. Consider for a moment the concept of scale itself, that seemingly fundamental dimension by which we measure all things, from the subatomic particles that compose matter to the vast cosmic structures that span billions of light years across the universe. We perceive a mountain as large and an atom as small, yet these designations exist only in relation to the human body and human perception, which themselves occupy an arbitrary position within the spectrum of possible scales. An ant might reasonably consider a grain of sand monumental while finding a pebble incomprehensibly vast, and from the perspective of a bacterium, even the ant becomes a landscape of geological proportions. Our instruments extend our senses in both directions, allowing us to measure things far smaller and far larger than our natural perception permits. Yet the question remains whether these measurements reveal scale as an objective feature of reality, or merely reflect our need to impose comparative frameworks onto a universe that may not inherently possess such hierarchical organization. Physics itself seems to suggest that scale is far less absolute than we assume, for the fundamental constants and laws that govern reality appear to operate across all magnitudes through mathematical relationships that remain elegant precisely because they function independently of human scale perception. A photon has no sense of being small, nor does a galaxy possess any awareness of being large, and the very act of calling something big or little introduces the observer's relative position into what we mistake for objective description. Yet we have built our entire civilization, our sciences, our technologies, and our languages upon the assumption that scale is a real and knowable property, that we can meaningfully order objects from smallest to largest and predict their behavior accordingly. We normalize this perspective so thoroughly that the alternative seems almost incomprehensible, even though physicists continue to uncover phenomena that suggest the universe operates according to principles that transcend our intuitive notions of comparative size and magnitude. Consider the student who spends years preparing for a career they never pursue, or the artist who speaks endlessly about the masterpiece they will create someday but never touches a brush, or the person who lies awake at night imagining all the conversations they might have had with someone they were too afraid to approach. We live our entire lives oriented toward futures that may never arrive, organizing our present moments around possibilities that exist nowhere except in the architecture of our minds, and yet we treat these potentials with the same weight and reality as the tangible things around us. The potential career feels as real as an actual job, the imagined artwork seems to matter as much as a completed painting, and the conversation that never happened often occupies more emotional space than many exchanges that actually did. This peculiar human tendency to invest ourselves so deeply in what could be rather than what is raises a fundamental question about the nature of existence itself. If potential never materializes, if it remains forever locked in the conditional future tense, in the subjunctive realm of what, if and might be, does it actually exist at all, or is it merely a phantom we have collectively agreed to perceive as real? The mechanism behind this phenomenon seems rooted in our need to maintain hope and agency in an uncertain world. By focusing on potential, we construct a narrative where our lives have infinite possibility, where failure and mediocrity are not permanent conditions, but merely delays on the path to our true destiny. We use potential as a psychological shield against the present moment's limitations, a way to tell ourselves that we are always one decision away from transformation. Yet this same mechanism traps us in perpetual deferral, in a state of becoming that may never resolve into being. The remarkable thing is how thoroughly we have normalized this phantom existence, how deeply we have woven potential into our economic systems, our educational structures, and our personal identities. We value people based on their perceived potential rather than their actual contributions. Consider the nature of inquiry itself, that fundamental act of human consciousness where we pose questions to the world around us and to ourselves, seeking clarity and understanding in the face of uncertainty. When we ask a question, we typically assume that the answer must come from somewhere external to the question, from observation or knowledge or reflection that stands apart from the interrogative act. Yet there exists a peculiar phenomenon where a question, through the very act of being asked, contains within it the seeds of its own resolution, where the process of formulating the question and contemplating its implications begins to illuminate the answer before we ever consciously discover it. Think of how asking yourself why you feel anxious often triggers a self-examination that gradually reveals the source of that anxiety, or how questioning whether you truly love someone leads you through such deep introspection that you arrive at genuine understanding. The question itself becomes a mirror that reflects back your own knowledge, and in asking, you are simultaneously answering through the very structure and implications embedded in the question's formation. This phenomenon reveals something profound about the relationship between inquiry and understanding, suggesting that knowledge is not always something external waiting to be discovered, but rather something already present within us that requires only the proper question to activate and crystallize it into conscious awareness. We have normalized this strange recursion entirely, treating it as obvious that self-examination reveals truth, yet when examined closely, it borders on paradoxical. A question that answers itself dissolves the boundary between asker and answered, between the seeker and the sought, collapsing the duality that we usually assume must exist for any genuine discovery to occur. Perhaps this is why the deepest questions, the ones that matter most to us, are often the ones we must answer ourselves, because they were never truly directed outward at all.